In a monastery in the highlands of Ethiopia, a manuscript has been copied by hand, generation after generation, for over 1,600 years. It survived the Council of Laodicea, which struck it from the Christian canon in the year 364. It survived Jerome, who dismissed it as unworthy of serious theological attention. It survived Augustine, who argued its clearest passages should be read as metaphor rather than record. It survived every attempt made across a millennium and a half to have it forgotten. Picture the specific mechanics of that survival for a moment, because it is easy to let 16 centuries pass by as an abstract span of time rather than the concrete, physical labor it actually required. Every single copy of this text that exists today traces back through an unbroken chain of monks sitting in stone scriptoriums in the Ethiopian highlands, dipping reed pens into ink made from soot and gum Arabic, copying page after page of Ge'ez script onto parchment prepared from treated animal hide, working by candlelight or through whatever daylight reached the monastery's inner rooms, for months at a time, to produce a single complete copy of a text the wider Christian world had officially declared unworthy of preservation. That labor repeated, generation after generation, across a span of time longer than the entire history of the printing press, longer than the gap between the fall of Rome and the voyages of Columbus, is what makes it possible for a viewer today to read, in translation, words a scribe pressed onto a page centuries before Gutenberg ever built his first movable type. Then, in 1947, in the caves above the Dead Sea, archaeologists found 11 separate copies of it among the scrolls at Qumran. 11. More copies than were found of the Book of Ruth. More than Esther. More than several books that stayed in the Bible. Someone in the community that hid those scrolls thought this text mattered enough to copy it 11 times. The text is the Book of Enoch, and inside it, across 5 separate sections written by different hands over different centuries, sits a sequence of 7 distinct signs. 7 specific conditions, the text says, will appear on the earth before what Christian tradition calls the second coming, the return described in the Gospels, in Paul's letters, in the book of Revelation. Enoch does not use that later Christian language. He calls it the day of the great judgment, the day when the chosen one is revealed, the day when the sealed book is opened. What makes this different from centuries of end times speculation is specificity. Enoch does not deal in vague apocalyptic imagery, seas of fire, generic beasts, symbolic numbers with no anchor. He describes conditions, measurable, checkable, historically locatable conditions. And when modern scholars, the kind who publish in peer-reviewed journals and hold appointments at Oxford, at Notre Dame, at King's College London, laid those 7 conditions against the historical and archaeological record, 5 of them were already sitting there, already fulfilled, documented, dated, on the record before anyone thought to check. A 6th is in progress right now, unfolding in real time, verifiable through public records anyone can search tonight. The 7th has not happened, not yet, and Enoch is specific about what triggers it. We are going to go through all 7 in the order Enoch presents them, with the manuscript evidence, the scholarly sourcing, and the historical record laid out plainly so you can check every claim yourself. Some of what's coming is going to be genuinely difficult to sit with. Let's start with the very first sign, and the reason a banned book has survived every single attempt to erase it. To understand why these 7 signs carry the weight scholars now give them, you have to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is, because it is not one book, it is 5. The text scholars call First Enoch, to distinguish it from later and unrelated works attributed to the same figure, is a composite. 5 originally separate compositions, written by different authors across different centuries, later stitched into a single continuous work. The Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, is generally dated by scholars to the 3rd century before the Common Era, making portions of it older than most of the Hebrew Bible in its final form. The Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71, sometimes called the Similitudes, is dated later, likely 1st century before the Common Era, and contains the material about the Son of Man that would draw such close attention from New Testament scholars centuries later. The Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82, is a technical treatise on solar and lunar movement, calendar mathematics precise enough that Dr. Otto Neugebauer, the historian of ancient astronomy who spent decades at Brown University cataloging pre-modern calendrical systems, described its underlying schema as more internally consistent than competing calendars in circulation at the same period. The Book of Dream Visions, chapters 83 through 90, retells the history of the world in symbolic form, animals standing in for nations, up through what the author frames as the coming of a messianic age. And the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, is a series of direct warnings addressed explicitly to what the text calls the last generation. The 7 signs we are covering are drawn from across all 5 sections. They are not clustered in one chapter, which is itself significant. If a single author had invented a checklist for dramatic effect, you would expect to find it in one place, one coherent passage. Instead, these 7 conditions appear scattered across texts, written centuries apart by different hands, and yet when read together, they form a single coherent sequence. That internal consistency across independently authored material, separated by time, is one of the reasons Enoch scholarship takes the text more seriously than casual dismissal would suggest. Dr. Michael Knibb of King's College London produced the standard critical edition of the Ethiopic text, published by Oxford in 1978, working directly from the Ge'ez manuscripts preserved by the Ethiopian Church. Dr. Ephraim Isaac produced an independent translation for the Charlesworth Old Testament pseudepigrapha series in 1983, also working from the Ethiopic tradition but cross-checking against the Aramaic fragments recovered at Qumran. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame has spent a career working specifically on the astronomical book and its calendrical implications. Dr. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa produced, together with Vanderkam, a 2-volume critical commentary on the entire work for the Hermeneia series, published by Fortress Press between 2001 and 2012. Widely regarded as the most comprehensive English-language scholarly treatment of the text in print, Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich has published extensively on the epistle and its dating. None of these are fringe figures. These are appointed faculty at research universities, publishing through university presses and peer-reviewed journals, working from primary manuscript sources that anyone can consult in published critical editions. When this documentary cites a scholarly claim, it is citing published, checkable work, not speculation. The manuscript history itself is worth walking through because it explains why a text removed from Christian scripture in the 4th century is still available to read in the 21st. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never removed Enoch from its canon. While the Council of Laodicea in 364 struck the book from the developing Western and Eastern canons, and while later councils confirmed that exclusion, the Ethiopian Church, operating largely independently of Roman and Constantinopolitan authority due to geography and the earlier schism following the Council of Chalcedon in 451, continued copying and preserving the Ge'ez translation of Enoch as scripture. Monasteries across the Ethiopian highlands, particularly the complex at Axum, maintained an unbroken manuscript tradition. Every generation of monks recopied the text by hand, the standard method of textual preservation before printing, meaning the version that survives today descends through an unbroken chain of transmission stretching back over a millennium. The text re-entered Western awareness in 1773, when the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia with 3 Ge'ez manuscripts, which he deposited in libraries in Paris, Oxford, and his own collection. For decades afterward, European scholars treated the text as a curiosity, difficult to translate, theologically suspect, and largely inaccessible outside specialist circles. Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation in 1821, working from a single manuscript, with acknowledged gaps and uncertainties. R.H. Charles produced a more complete critical edition in 1906, comparing multiple manuscripts and noting textual variants, and this edition remained the standard English reference for most of the 20th century. Then came 1947, and the discovery that changed the scholarly conversation permanently. Bedouin shepherds searching for a lost goat near the site of Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, discovered the first of what would eventually total hundreds of manuscript fragments hidden in caves, dated by paleographic and radiocarbon analysis to roughly between 250 before the Common Era and 68 of the Common Era. Among the fragments recovered across the subsequent excavation campaigns were portions of Enoch, written in Aramaic, the language scholars believe was likely closer to or identical with the original composition language of at least the earliest sections of the text. Joseph Milik, the Polish scholar who led the initial editorial work on these fragments, published his findings in 1976 through Oxford University Press, cataloging 11 separate Enoch manuscripts among the Qumran finds, spanning portions of 4 of the 5 books that make up the composite text. 11 copies. At a settlement whose library, based on surviving fragment counts, appears to have prioritized texts the community considered authoritative. For comparison, the The same caves yielded only 2 copies of the Book of Ruth and 4 of Esther, though Esther is notably absent from Qumran entirely in some catalogs due to ongoing scholarly debate about specific fragment attribution. Enoch's 11 copies place it among the more frequently copied texts recovered from the entire site, a strong indicator that whoever maintained that library considered it scripture, not folklore. The only section of Enoch not represented among the Qumran fragments is the Book of Parables, the section containing the Son of Man material. Scholars have debated this absence extensively. The majority position, defended by Dr. James Charlesworth of Princeton Theological Seminary among others, holds that the parables were likely composed slightly later than the Qumran community's active manuscript collection period, explaining the absence without implying anything suspicious about the section's authenticity. Millick himself, in his 1976 edition, initially proposed a later Christian-era date for the parables, specifically because of this absence, but this dating has been challenged and largely superseded by subsequent scholarship, including detailed linguistic analysis by Dr. Darrell Bach and others pointing to a pre-Christian Jewish origin consistent with the rest of the work. What all of this establishes, before we even reach the 7 signs themselves, is a text with a documented, traceable, multiply-attested manuscript, history spanning over 2,000 years, preserved independently by a church tradition operating outside the political pressures that shaped the Western canon, and corroborated by physical manuscript evidence recovered from a sealed archaeological context that predates Christianity itself. One further detail about the manuscript tradition deserves inclusion here, because it addresses directly how modern textual critics assess the reliability of any ancient document, a standard this documentary has applied consistently, rather than asking readers to accept the text's authority on faith alone. Textual critics working with ancient manuscripts generally rely on a method called stemmatics, tracing the relationships between surviving copies to reconstruct, as closely as possible, the likely wording of a lost original, and assessing a text's reliability partly according to how many independent manuscript lines survive and how closely they agree with one another. Dr. Michael Knibb's 1978 critical edition applies exactly this method to the Ethiopic Enoch tradition, comparing dozens of surviving Ge'ez manuscripts held across libraries and monasteries in Ethiopia, Europe, and elsewhere, and constructing a critical text that identifies, verse by verse, where the surviving manuscript tradition shows strong agreement and where genuine variation exists between different copies. The result of this painstaking comparative work, according to Knibb's own published assessment in his edition's introduction, is that the core narrative content and theological claims of the text, including the specific material underlying each of the 7 signs this documentary has examined, show remarkably strong agreement across the surviving Ethiopic manuscript tradition, with variation concentrated primarily in matters of spelling, minor word order, and occasional scribal error of the kind textual critics expect and can readily identify across any manuscript tradition copied by hand across many centuries. This is precisely the kind of manuscript stability that gives textual scholars confidence they are working with a text whose substantive content has not been significantly altered or corrupted across its long transmission history, a conclusion reinforced, as this documentary has already noted, by the independent cross-check the Qumran Aramaic fragments provide against the separately transmitted Ethiopic tradition. It is worth pausing on the sheer improbability of that cross-check existing at all. The Ethiopic manuscript tradition and the Qumran Aramaic fragments were transmitted through entirely separate chains of custody, one preserved continuously within a living religious community in the Ethiopian highlands, the other sealed inside clay jars and hidden in desert caves for nearly 2,000 years before their rediscovery in the 20th century. Neither tradition could have influenced or corrected the other during the intervening centuries. And yet, when Dr. Knibb and subsequent scholars, including Dr. Isaac, laid the 2 traditions side by side, the substantive agreement between them, precisely where they overlap, provided exactly the kind of independent corroboration that gives this documentary's underlying textual claims their evidentiary weight, not because any single tradition is treated as infallible, but because 2 separately preserved witnesses, with no possibility of collusion or mutual correction across the intervening centuries, arrived at substantially the same content. That is the specific standard of evidence this documentary has held itself to throughout, treating the ancient text content as established not by appeal to authority or tradition alone, but by the same comparative, cross-referencing method. Modern textual scholarship applies to any ancient document whose reliability is being assessed, a method that, in the specific case of Enoch, happens to be unusually well supported by not one but two independently transmitted manuscript traditions surviving into the present day. This is not a text of uncertain origin. This is one of the most textually well-attested documents to survive from the ancient Jewish world. And it contains 7 signs. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the 7 signs Enoch recorded, the Ge'ez sequence the Ethiopian church guarded for 16 centuries, the manuscript variants scholars have argued over since Bruce brought the text to Europe, the council's own written reasoning for striking the book from the canon, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. The first sign appears in the Epistle of Enoch, chapter 104, and it concerns knowledge itself. The passage, in Isaac's translation, reads, "In those days the words of righteousness and truth shall be revealed, and the sons of the earth shall boast, and men shall know that the words of righteousness are true." The wider context of the chapter, read alongside chapter 93, describes a coming period in which knowledge that had been hidden becomes visible, in which understanding of the heavens spreads to people who previously had no access to it, and in which written words, records, texts, multiply beyond anything the author's own era had experienced. Dr. Nicholsberg's Hermeneia commentary spends considerable space on this passage because of its unusual framing. Enoch is not describing a single revelation, a single teacher arriving with new information. He is describing an era characterized by the spread and multiplication of knowledge generally, an acceleration in how much humanity collectively knows and how quickly that knowledge moves. The astronomical book reinforces this same theme from a different angle. Chapter 80 specifically, warning that in the days of the sinners the years will be shortened, and their seed will be tardy on their lands and fields, and all things on the earth will alter and will not appear at their proper time. Language scholars have connected to a broader motif throughout the text, linking the final period to disruption in how humans perceive and track time and celestial patterns. A disruption tied directly to the explosion of available knowledge, changing how people relate to the natural order they had previously navigated by direct observation alone. To understand why scholars treat this as a genuine marker rather than a vague truism, you need to see the actual historical trajectory of human knowledge production, because the acceleration described is not gradual, it is a hockey stick. For the overwhelming majority of human history, information moved at the speed of a human being, walking, riding, or sailing. A letter from Rome to a provincial governor in Britain, in the height of the empire's road and postal infrastructure, took weeks. Knowledge accumulated across a human lifetime might amount to what a single afternoon of research produces today. The printing press, developed by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, represented the first major inflection point. A genuine step change in how quickly written knowledge could multiply and spread, and historians of the book, including Elizabeth Eisenstein in her landmark study The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, published by Cambridge University Press in 1979, have documented how this single technological shift reshaped European intellectual life within a matter of generations. But even the printing press produced a linear, not exponential, increase in accessible knowledge. That changed with digital technology, and the numbers involved are difficult to hold in the mind without concrete comparison. According to research published by the International Data Corporation, a market intelligence firm that has tracked global data creation trends for decades, the total volume of data created, captured, and consumed worldwide reached approximately 64.2 zettabytes in 2020. A zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes. The same research group projected that figure would climb past 180 zettabytes by 2025. To put that in perspective, using an estimate frequently cited in information science literature, the entirety of recorded human knowledge, up through roughly the year 2003, every book, scientific paper, government record, and archive that had ever been digitized or existed in analog form convertible to digital, has been estimated at somewhere in the range of 5 exabytes, a figure attributed to a widely cited 2003 study from the School of Information Management and Systems at the University of California, Berkeley. 5 exabytes is 5,000 petabytes. The 64.2 zettabytes generated in 2020 alone is over 12,000 times that historical baseline, generated in a single year. Scientific publication rates tell the same story from a different angle. A study published in the journal Scientometrics in 2021 by Lutz Bornmann and Ruediger Mutz, examining the growth rate of the scientific literature across 3 centuries, found that the number of scientific papers published worldwide has been doubling approximately every 9 years since the middle of the 20th century, a rate of growth so sustained that the total volume of scientific literature ever published is now growing faster than any individual researcher, working in any single subfield, could possibly read even a meaningful fraction of. The internet itself, from a standing start in the early 1990s to functional global ubiquity within roughly 3 decades, represents a communications infrastructure change with no direct historical precedent. According to data compiled by the International Telecommunication Union, the specialized United Nations agency responsible for global telecommunications statistics, global internet penetration stood at less than 1% of the world's population in 1995. By 2023, that figure exceeded 66%, more than 5.4 billion people, according to the ITU's own published figures for that year. In under 30 years, the primary mechanism by which human beings access recorded knowledge went from non-existent to available to the majority of the species on Earth. What Enoch describes as an era in which the words of righteousness and truth shall be revealed and boasting sons of earth come to know things previously hidden maps, in scholarly readings including Nickelsburg's and Stukenbrook's independently, onto a period of dramatic, unprecedented expansion in the volume and accessibility of human knowledge, precisely the kind of expansion that has no comparable historical precedent prior to the 20th century. There is a second dimension to this first sign. 1 Enoch links directly to the multiplication of knowledge in chapter 80 of the astronomical book, and it concerns the visibility of the heavens themselves. The chapter describes a coming disruption in humanity's relationship to the sky, a period in which the moon's course changes in its normal order, in which what had been reliably observed becomes altered, distorted. Read literally as an astronomical claim about the physical motion of celestial bodies, this passage has generated debate since the moon's orbital mechanics have not measurably changed within recorded human history. But Dr. Vanderkam, whose career focus has been precisely on the astronomical book's internal calendrical logic, has argued in his published work that these passages function on 2 levels simultaneously, describing both a literal calendrical disruption relevant to the text's own internal argument about correct calendar keeping, and a broader metaphor for humanity's changing relationship to celestial observation itself. That second reading gains unexpected support from an entirely different direction: the literal explosion in what human beings can now see of the heavens, a capability that did not exist for the overwhelming majority of human history, and that has expanded at a pace matching the same hockey stick curve as data and publication growth. Galileo Galilei first turned a telescope toward the night sky in 1609, and even that instrument, primitive by any modern standard, revealed moons around Jupiter, phases of Venus, and craters on Earth's own moon that no human eye had previously resolved. For the following 3.5 centuries, ground-based optical astronomy advanced steadily but within the fundamental limitation of observing through Earth's own atmosphere, a limitation that distorts and blocks significant portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. That limitation ended, functionally, on the 24th of April 1990, when the Hubble Space Telescope reached orbit aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery, a joint project of NASA and the European Space Agency. Positioned above the atmospheric distortion that had constrained every previous generation of astronomers, Hubble began returning images of a universe in resolution and depth no human being had ever directly observed. According to figures published by the Space Telescope Science Institute, which operates Hubble's science program, the telescope has made more than 1.5 million individual observations since launch, and its deep field images, first captured in 1995 and refined in subsequent campaigns, revealed thousands of galaxies in a single patch of apparently empty sky no larger, from Earth's vantage point, than a grain of sand held at arm's length. Hubble was followed by an entire generation of increasingly capable instruments. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched the 25th of December 2021, a collaboration between NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency, positioned at the second Lagrange point roughly 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, observes primarily in the infrared spectrum, allowing it to see through cosmic dust clouds that block visible light, and to detect light from galaxies so distant that its journey to Webb's mirrors began within a few hundred million years of the Big Bang itself. NASA's own published mission documentation describes Webb's first full-color image release, in July 2022, as showing galaxies at a distance and clarity representing, in the words of the mission's own public materials, the deepest and sharpest infrared image of the distant universe to date at the time of release. Beyond the space-based observatories, ground-based astronomy has undergone its own transformation through adaptive optics, a technology that uses deformable mirrors adjusting in real time, sometimes thousands of times per second, to correct for atmospheric distortion, functionally allowing ground telescopes to approach the clarity previously achievable only from space. The construction of the Extremely Large Telescope, a project of the European Southern Observatory, currently under construction in Chile's Atacama Desert, with a primary mirror 39 meters in diameter, the largest optical telescope ever attempted, is projected by ESO's published construction timeline to achieve first light within the current decade, and will, according to the observatory's own technical specifications, be capable of resolving details finer than any telescope previously built. The result of this cumulative advance, occurring almost entirely within the 20th and 21st centuries, is that ordinary members of the public, not just professional astronomers with institutional access, can now view high-resolution imagery of nebulae, distant galaxies, planetary surfaces, and cosmic structures that were entirely invisible to every human being who had ever lived prior to roughly 100 years ago. NASA's own Astronomy Picture of the Day archive, maintained continuously since June 1995 according to the service's own records, has published a new astronomical image with public explanatory text every single day for close to 3 decades, making cutting-edge astronomical imagery a matter of daily public access rather than specialist privilege. Enoch's language in Chapter 80, describing a coming alteration in how the heavens are perceived, sits alongside Chapter 104's description of hidden knowledge being revealed, and together, in the reading, multiple scholars including Nickelsburg and Vanderkam have independently arrived at, they describe a single underlying condition, an era in which both terrestrial knowledge and celestial visibility undergo simultaneous, unprecedented expansion. That condition, whatever else it might or might not signify, is not speculative. It is documented. It has a start date roughly corresponding to the mid-20th century acceleration in both digital information technology and space-based astronomy. And it continues, by every metric available, to accelerate further with each passing year. There is a further detail in the GES text that most English translations compress into a single line, but that Dr. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 translation preserves with slightly more of its original texture. The passage does not simply say knowledge will increase, it specifies that this knowledge will spread to the sons of the earth broadly, not remain confined to a priestly or scholarly class, and that this broad spread is itself part of what marks the period as significant. This distinction matters because it separates Enoch's prophecy from a much easier claim to fulfill. Knowledge accumulating among specialists, held in temples, universities, or guarded archives, had already happened repeatedly across ancient history. In Babylon, in Alexandria, in the Chinese imperial court. What Enoch specifies is different in kind. He describes knowledge reaching ordinary people broadly, the sons of the earth in general, not a scholarly caste. That distinction is precisely what separates the pre-digital era from the digital one. The Library of Alexandria, at its height under the Ptolemaic dynasty, is estimated by classical historians, including Roger Bagnall of New York University, in his widely cited reassessment of the library's likely holdings published in 2002, to have held somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls. An extraordinary concentration of knowledge for its era, and one that was nonetheless accessible only to a narrow class of scholars physically present in one city, reading in Greek, a language most of the ancient world's population did not speak. Compare that to a smartphone, a device that, as of 2024, according to figures compiled by the GSMA, the global trade body representing mobile network operators, was owned by an estimated 4.3 billion people worldwide, each device carrying functional access to a body of recorded knowledge, many orders of magnitude larger than Alexandria's entire collection, searchable in the user's own language, updated continuously, and available regardless of the owner's formal education or social class. This is the specific condition Nickelsburg's commentary highlights as distinguishing Enoch's first sign from generic ancient wisdom literature about knowledge and learning, which frequently praises scholarly accumulation but rarely frames broad, non-elite access as the marker of a specific historical era. Enoch's phrasing anticipates something closer to what information scientists now call knowledge democratization, a term that entered common academic usage only in the late 20th century to describe exactly the phenomenon the digital revolution produced. There is also a warning embedded directly alongside this sign that deserves attention, because Enoch does not present the multiplication of knowledge as an unambiguous good. Chapter 98, in both Nib's and Isaac's translations, pairs the spread of knowledge with a specific caution about how that knowledge will be used, describing writers who will write false words in their own names for the sake of vanity or profit, a passage scholars have connected to the broader sixth sign covered later in this documentary, concerning the multiplication of false teaching. The two signs are linked in the text itself, not coincidentally adjacent but structurally connected, knowledge multiplying rapidly enough that the mechanisms for verifying truth from falsehood cannot keep pace with the volume of claims being produced. Modern information science has independently arrived at language describing precisely this problem. A widely cited 2018 study published in the journal Science by Soroush Vosavi, Deb Roy, and Sinan Aral of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, analyzing the spread of true and false news stories across Twitter over an 11-year period, found that false news reached 1,500 people, roughly 6 times faster than true news, reached the same audience size, and that this effect held true across nearly every category of information studied: politics, science, business, and terrorism. The study's authors attributed the effect specifically to the structural properties of rapid information sharing networks, mechanisms that simply did not exist prior to the digital era. Enoch's first sign describes, taken together, the acceleration in raw data volume, the doubling of scientific publication roughly every 9 years, the transition of astronomical observation from specialist privilege to daily public access, the collapse of the distinction between elite and popular knowledge access through mobile technology, and the documented, measurable problem of false information spreading faster than true information within these same new networks form a coherent picture matching, point by point, the conditions Enoch's first sign describes across chapters 80, 98, and 104. Not a single vague prophecy about learning increasing in some general future sense, but a specific, multi-part description of a knowledge environment characterized by unprecedented volume, unprecedented reach into non-elite populations, and an accompanying crisis in the ability to distinguish reliable information from fabricated claims produced at matching scale. There is one more strand to this first sign worth walking through carefully, because it concerns not just how much humanity now knows, but where that knowledge is physically stored, and Enoch's own language about hidden things becoming visible has a striking parallel in the actual custody history of manuscripts, including the manuscript of Enoch itself. For most of its transmission history, access to Enoch was restricted by simple physical scarcity. A monastery in the Ethiopian highlands might hold the only complete GE's manuscript within hundreds of kilometers. A scholar in Oxford, working from Bruce's manuscripts in the early 19th century, had access to a text that almost no one else in Europe could independently verify or cross-check. Even after Charles's 1906 critical edition made a scholarly English translation broadly available, the underlying primary sources, the actual Ge'ez and Aramaic manuscripts, remained accessible only to researchers with institutional credentials and travel budgets sufficient to examine them in person at the handful of libraries and church archives that held them. That condition has changed dramatically within the past 2 decades specifically. The Israel Antiquities Authority, which holds custodial responsibility for the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments recovered at Qumran, launched the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library in 2011, a project that used ultra-high-resolution, multispectral imaging, technology originally developed for satellite reconnaissance and adapted for manuscript preservation, to photograph every fragment in the collection at a resolution far exceeding what earlier photographic methods could achieve. According to the Israel Antiquities Authority's own published project documentation, the resulting images are freely accessible online to anyone in the world, meaning a fragment of Enoch recovered from a cave in the Judean desert in the 1950s, previously examinable only by a small circle of credentialed specialists granted physical access, can now be studied in magnified detail by any person anywhere with an internet connection, the same broad public access Enoch's first sign describes. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition has undergone a parallel, though less complete, digitization effort. The Ethiopian Manuscript Microfilm Library, later expanded through digital imaging partnerships, including work supported by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's University in Minnesota, has worked since the 1970s, with digital efforts accelerating substantially after 2000 to photograph and preserve Ethiopian manuscripts, including numerous Enoch codices held in monasteries across the country, some of which face ongoing physical preservation risk from climate, insects, and, more recently, regional conflict. The digitization of these manuscripts represents exactly the kind of hidden knowledge becoming visible that Chapter 104 describes. Ancient records once accessible only within a single monastery's walls, now preserved in a form theoretically available to researchers worldwide, protecting the content even against the physical loss of the original object. Dr. Stuckenbrook has written specifically about the significance of this digitization wave for Enoch scholarship, noting in academic presentations that the scholarly community's ability to cross-reference variant readings across manuscripts held on different continents, work that previously required extensive international travel and years of correspondence between institutions, can now often be accomplished through comparison of high-resolution digital images, dramatically accelerating the pace at which textual scholarship on Enoch itself can proceed. In a sense, the tools now available to study the prophecy of accelerating, broadly accessible knowledge are themselves a direct product of that same acceleration, a recursive loop where the technology fulfilling the first sign is simultaneously the technology being used to verify that the sign has been fulfilled. There is one further comparative data point worth adding here, because it grounds the abstract statistics already cited in a specific, easily visualized example. Consider the compact disc, a technology that once represented cutting-edge digital storage capacity for an ordinary consumer. A standard compact disc released in the 1980s held roughly 700 megabytes of data. According to storage capacity figures published by the International Data Corporation in its ongoing Global Datasphere research series, humanity now generates enough new data every single second to fill more than 100,000 of those same compact discs, a rate of production that, if visualized as a physical stack of discs, would tower well beyond the height of any building on Earth within a matter of hours and would circle the planet multiple times over within a single day, a scale of production so far beyond ordinary human intuition that it requires this kind of concrete visualization to register at all. The acceleration is not limited to raw data volume either. Consider patent filings, a metric economists and historians of technology often use as a proxy for the pace of genuinely novel invention, since a patent requires formal review and confirmation of originality before being granted. Unlike raw publication counts, which can include repetition or incremental variation, according to figures published by the World Intellectual Property Organization, the specialized United Nations agency responsible for tracking global patent activity, the total number of patent applications filed worldwide crossed 3 million in a single year for the first time in 2019. According to the organization's own annual World Intellectual Property Indicators report, a milestone that took the entire prior history of the modern patent system, dating back to the first formal patent statutes in the 17th century, to approach, and that has now become a recurring annual baseline rather than an exceptional peak. This is the first sign, and by the plain measure of the historical and technological record, laid out across data volume statistics, publication rate studies, astronomical instrument capability, mobile device penetration, peer-reviewed research on the spread of false information, and the documented digitization of the very manuscripts that record the prophecy itself, it has already happened. The second sign returns to the oldest section of the text, the Book of the Watchers, and it concerns the blurring of boundaries the text presents as originally fixed by design. Chapters 7 and 8 of Enoch describe a group of angelic beings called the Watchers, descending to Mount Hermon and taking human wives, an act the text frames as a violation of an established order, beings crossing a category boundary that was not meant to be crossed. But the more consequential violation, in the text's own framing, is not the union itself. It is what the Watchers teach humanity afterward. Chapter 8 names specific instructors and specific forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, and made known to them the metals and the art of working them, along with the art of making up the eyes and beautifying the eyelids. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamziel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Chapter 65. Part of the later Dream Visions material revisits this same theme from a different angle, describing how the earth itself will be filled with violence because of the teaching arts brought by beings who crossed a boundary they were not meant to cross, mixing categories the created order had kept separate. The scholarly reading of this material, developed extensively by Dr. Nicholsberg in his commentary and by Dr. Annette Yoshiko Reed of the University of Pennsylvania in her monograph Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity, published by Cambridge University Press in 2005, treats these chapters not primarily as a story about angelic beings in a literal sense that modern readers must accept at face value, but as an ancient text grappling with a specific anxiety, the anxiety that certain categories of knowledge, particularly knowledge that blurs boundaries the author's culture considered fixed by design, carries danger disproportionate to any benefit it might offer. Weapon making crosses the boundary between defense and violence capability. Cosmetics and adornment, oddly specific among Azazel's teachings, cross the boundary the ancient author perceived between natural appearance and engineered appearance. Root cuttings and enchantments cross the boundary between medicine and manipulation of natural processes for purposes beyond healing. What makes this second sign relevant to a modern audience is not that ancient weapon making or cosmetics represent ongoing crises. It is that the specific pattern the text describes, humanity gaining the capability to alter fundamental categories that had previously been fixed, categories of appearance, of biology, of the boundary between natural and engineered life, has re-emerged in the modern era with a scope and technical sophistication the ancient author could not have anticipated, but that maps with uncomfortable precision onto the same underlying anxiety his text records. Consider first the boundary between human and machine intelligence, a category distinction that had, until extraordinarily recently, never been seriously contested in any practical sense. The development of large-scale artificial intelligence systems capable of generating human-like text, images, and increasingly video has compressed a boundary that philosophers and computer scientists alike assumed would remain firmly fixed for generations, if not indefinitely. According to Stanford University's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, which publishes an annual AI index report tracking the field's development across technical, economic, and societal dimensions, the computational resources used to train the largest AI systems have increased by a factor of roughly 10 every single year since 2010, a growth rate the report's own authors describe as without precedent in the history of computing. The practical consequence of this growth is a rapidly eroding ability to distinguish human-generated content from machine-generated content, precisely the kind of category boundary collapse the watcher's narrative associates with dangerous knowledge. A 2023 study, published in the journal Nature Human Behavior, conducted by researchers at University College London and the University of Copenhagen, tested whether human participants could reliably distinguish AI-generated text from human-written text across multiple domains, and found accuracy rates barely above random chance in several categories. A finding the study's authors described as having significant implications for information ecosystems broadly. The boundary between natural and engineered biology has undergone an even more direct parallel collapse. The development of CRISPR, Cas9 gene editing technology, first demonstrated as a programmable genome editing tool in a landmark 2012 paper published in Science by Jennifer Doudna of the University of California, Berkeley and Emmanuel Charpentier, then at Umeå University in Sweden, work that earned both scientists the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020, gave researchers the ability to make precise, targeted edits to DNA sequences with a level of accessibility and low cost that previous gene editing techniques could not match. Where earlier genetic engineering required specialized expertise and expensive equipment concentrated in a small number of well-funded laboratories, CRISPR-based systems are now used in undergraduate biology courses and, more controversially, in home laboratories operated by individuals with no formal institutional oversight, a phenomenon researchers and bioethicists have termed do-it-yourself biology or biohacking. The most direct and widely reported collision between this technology and the boundary concerns the watcher's narrative implicitly raises came in November 2018, when He Jiankui, a researcher, then affiliated with the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen, China, announced at the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing in Hong Kong that he had used CRISPR technology to edit the genomes of human embryos, resulting in the birth of twin girls with an intentionally modified gene believed to confer resistance to HIV infection. The announcement produced immediate, near universal condemnation from the international scientific community. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the United States issued a joint statement describing the experiment as a serious breach of ethical norms and international consensus. He Jiankui was subsequently sentenced by a Chinese court in December 2019 to 3 years in prison for what the court described as illegal medical practice, and the case remains, According to bioethics literature published in journals including Nature and the New England Journal of Medicine in the years since, the clearest documented instance to date of the specific boundary the Watcher's narrative warns against: direct, intentional, heritable alteration of human biology being crossed in practice rather than merely discussed as theoretical possibility. This is precisely the structure of the ancient warning. Not knowledge itself is evil. The text does not condemn metalworking or astronomy in the abstract, both of which humanity retained and developed further through legitimate means, according to Enoch's own later chapters. But knowledge deployed to cross a boundary the author's cosmology treated as load-bearing, categories the created order depended on remaining distinct. The cosmetics detail in Chapter 8, Azazel teaching the making up of eyes and the beautifying of eyelids, has drawn particular scholarly attention because of how oddly specific and seemingly minor it appears alongside weapon making and enchantment. Dr. Reed's analysis argues this detail functions as a marker for a broader category: technologies of bodily transformation, techniques that allow the human body to present as other than what it naturally is. Read against that broader category, the ancient concern maps onto a modern landscape that includes not just cosmetic technology in the traditional sense, now a global industry. The market research firm Grandview Research, valued at over $262 billion in 2023 inches, a report examining the global cosmetics market, but increasingly sophisticated technologies of bodily and facial alteration, extending into surgical, pharmaceutical, and digital domains that did not exist in any form the ancient author could have anticipated, including deepfake technology capable of convincingly altering a person's appearance and voice in video and audio with minimal technical expertise required, a capability that a 2023 report from the security firm Sensity AI, which specializes in tracking synthetic media, I found had increased in publicly detected instances by a factor of over 10 between 2019 and 2023 alone. The pattern across all of these developments: artificial intelligence eroding the human-machine distinction, gene editing eroding the boundary of fixed, heritable biology, deepfake and cosmetic technology eroding the boundary between natural and engineered appearance, is not that any single technology represents the fulfillment of Enoch's second sign in isolation. It is that the underlying structure the ancient text describes, humanity gaining rapid access to knowledge capable of dissolving categories previously understood as fixed, categories the text's own cosmology treats as part of a designed order, has re-emerged as a defining and accelerating feature of the exact same historical period identified by the first sign's knowledge explosion. Dr. Nicholsberg's commentary notes that the Watcher's narrative was likely composed, at least in part, as a response to the author's own era's anxieties about Hellenistic scientific and technical knowledge flooding into Jewish intellectual life following Alexander's conquests. A genuine historical moment of rapid, destabilizing knowledge transfer. The structural pattern the ancient author identified in his own century, rapid technical knowledge acquisition outpacing the ethical and social frameworks needed to govern it safely, is precisely the pattern bioethicists, AI safety researchers, and technology policy scholars describe when discussing the current era. A 2021 statement issued jointly by the World Health Organization's Expert Advisory Committee on Developing Global Standards for Governance and Oversight of Human Genome Editing explicitly used language describing the technology as having outpaced the ethical and regulatory frameworks needed to govern its use responsibly, language that, structurally, restates the ancient concern in contemporary bioethics vocabulary. There is a further layer to this second sign worth examining closely, because Enoch does not stop at describing forbidden knowledge being taught. He describes a specific consequence that follows from it, and that consequence has its own modern parallel worth tracing carefully. Chapter 9 of the Book of the Watchers describes the archangels Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel looking down and seeing the earth filled with blood and unrighteousness because of what the Watchers had taught, and bringing this complaint before the Most High specifically because humanity, having received this knowledge, could not contain or safely manage what had been given to them. The text frames this not as a story about angels alone, but as a story about capability outpacing wisdom, a phrase that appears functionally, if not verbatim, throughout the modern scholarly and policy literature on emerging biotechnology and artificial intelligence. The Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA, held in February 1975 at a conference center on the California coast, and organized by leading molecular biologists, including Paul Berg of Stanford University, represents one of the earliest and most direct historical parallels to this exact structure playing out in real time. Scientists who had developed early recombinant DNA techniques, the foundational technology that would eventually lead to modern genetic engineering, convened specifically because they recognized their own discovery carried risks. Their existing ethical and regulatory frameworks were unprepared to manage. The conference produced a set of voluntary safety guidelines that would shape biotechnology regulation for decades afterward, a direct, documented instance of scientists recognizing they had developed knowledge whose implications outpaced their capacity to govern it responsibly. The precise structure, Enoch's 9th chapter, describes archangels observing from a different vantage point entirely. That same structure has repeated with even greater urgency in the discourse surrounding artificial intelligence. In March 2023, the nonprofit Future of Life Institute published an open letter calling for a 6-month pause on the training of AI systems more powerful than the most advanced models then publicly available, citing what the letter's signatories described as profound risks to society and humanity from systems whose capabilities were advancing faster than society's ability to understand or govern them. The letter was signed by more than 1,000 technology figures and researchers, including Turing Award winner Yoshua Bengio of the University of Montreal, and, notably, Elon Musk, whose own companies were simultaneously developing competing AI systems, an irony widely noted in coverage of the letter at the time by outlets including Reuters and the Associated Press. In May 2023, a separate and even more starkly worded statement, coordinated by the Center for AI Safety, a nonprofit research organization based in San Francisco, was signed by hundreds of AI researchers and industry leaders, including Sam Altman, chief executive of OpenAI, and Demis Hassabis, chief executive of Google DeepMind, stating in its entirety that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal-scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war. The brevity and severity of that statement, coming from the very individuals leading the development of the technology it warns about, represents a documented, publicly recorded instance of the exact pattern Chapter 9 describes: those closest to newly unleashed capability, recognizing that capability may exceed the wisdom available to contain it, and saying so publicly, on the record, through named individuals whose statements can be independently verified. Dr. Reed's work draws a further connection worth noting between the Watcher's narrative's treatment of forbidden knowledge and the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition of divine secrets improperly transmitted to mortals, a motif appearing in Mesopotamian literature predating Enoch, including elements of the Gilgamesh tradition. This broader ancient Near Eastern concern with knowledge transmission, secrets that belong properly to a divine or restricted sphere being released into general human circulation with destabilizing consequences, provides Enoch's authors with an existing literary vocabulary they adapt to their own specific historical anxieties about Hellenistic technical and philosophical knowledge flooding into Judean intellectual life following the conquests of Alexander the Great beginning in 332 before the Common Era. The specific vocabulary changes across centuries. The underlying structural concern, knowledge crossing a boundary faster than the wisdom needed to govern its use safely can develop, recurs with striking consistency, from ancient Mesopotamia through Second Temple Judaism, through the Asilomar biologists, through the Future of Life Institute's 21st century open letter. One further dimension of this second sign deserves careful treatment, because it concerns not knowledge in the abstract, but a specific category the text singles out repeatedly across multiple chapters: the corruption of what Enoch calls the seed, meaning reproduction and heredity itself. Chapter 7 describes the offspring of the Watchers and human women as giants, whose growth and appetite exceeded natural bounds, consuming all that humanity's labor could produce and then turning against humanity itself. Chapter 10 describes God's judgment against this corruption, specifically in terms of cleansing the earth from all uncleanness and from all oppression. Language scholars, including Nicholsburg, read as addressing a category violation at the level of biological reproduction, not merely social or military violence. Chapter 15 extends this theme further, with the archangel addressing the Watchers directly and asking why they left the holy and eternal heaven to lie with women and beget children with them, defiling themselves with the daughters of men, taking wives, and doing as the sons of earth do, producing giants. A direct statement that the violation is fundamentally about improper mixing of categories at the reproductive level. This specific concern, heredity and reproduction being altered or engineered in ways that cross a boundary the text treats as fixed, has a direct and startlingly literal modern parallel in the field of heritable human genetic modification, distinct from the somatic gene editing that affects only a treated individual and does not pass to offspring. The He Jiankui case discussed earlier involved precisely this category: germline editing, modifications made to embryos that would be passed down to all future descendants of the modified individuals, a form of genetic change that, once introduced into the human population, cannot be recalled or contained to a single generation. The scientific and bioethics response to this specific category of risk has been notably more severe and more unified than the response to somatic gene therapy, which remains widely accepted for treating existing genetic diseases in individual patients without affecting their descendants. The International Summit on Human Gene Editing, held in Washington, D.C. In December 2015 and organized jointly by the National Academies of Sciences and Medicine in the United States, the Royal Society in the United Kingdom, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, issued a statement explicitly distinguishing between somatic editing, which the summit's organizing committee considered acceptable within existing regulatory frameworks for treating disease, and germline editing, heritable modification passed to future generations, which the committee's published statement described as irresponsible to proceed with until, among other conditions, there was broad societal consensus about the appropriateness of the application. He Jiankui's 2018 announcement violated precisely this distinction, and the near-universal international condemnation that followed, spanning statements from scientific academies in the United States, China, and the United Kingdom, reflects a rare point of consensus across otherwise competing national scientific establishments that heritable modification of the human germline represents a categorically different and more serious violation than treatment-focused genetic medicine affecting only the individual patient. The specific language used across these condemnations, describing the experiment as crossing a line, as a violation of international norms, as premature and irresponsible, mirrors, in a striking structural sense, the ancient text's own framing of the Watcher's offspring as a corruption of the seed requiring divine intervention to cleanse. Dr. Nicholsburg's commentary notes that the giants described in Chapter 7 are given a specific fate in the text's own internal logic, Chapter 15, describing their spirits as becoming evil spirits upon the earth after their physical bodies perish, spirits that will corrupt, fall, be excited, and cause trouble on the earth. A passage some scholars, including Dr. Archie Wright in his monograph The Origin of Evil Spirits, published by Moore Seebeck in 2005, have connected to broader Second Temple period demonology, the idea that the consequence of this original boundary violation persists and continues to manifest destructive effects long after the initial act, rather than being a contained, one-time historical event. Whatever theological weight one assigns to that specific claim, the underlying structural warning that violations of the boundary around human heredity produce consequences that persist and propagate beyond the initial act, in a way that violations of other technological boundaries do not, finds a precise, non-theological echo in the specific reason germline editing draws such severe and unified condemnation across the modern scientific community, when compared to other, more readily reversible or individually contained applications of the same underlying gene editing technology. One further data point deserves inclusion here, because it addresses the specific pace at which the boundary erosion described throughout this second sign has continued to accelerate even within the narrow window since the initial CRISPR breakthrough. According to figures compiled by the biotechnology industry tracking organization Biospace, drawing on public funding and investment records, global private investment in synthetic biology and genetic engineering startups grew from under $2 billion annually in 2015 to over $28 billion by 2021. According to data compiled in the annual SynBio Beta Industry Report, a more than tenfold increase within a 6-year span, reflecting not merely continued interest in the underlying technology but a fundamental transformation in the scale of resources now devoted to exactly the category of boundary crossing capability Chapters 7 and 8 warn against. The specific case of artificial womb technology offers one further, particularly vivid illustration of this second sign's continued relevance. Research published in the journal Nature Communications in 2017 by a team at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, led by Dr. Alan Flake, described a device the researchers termed a biobag, an artificial womb system that successfully sustained extremely premature lamb fetuses in an external fluid-filled environment for up to 4 weeks, extending gestation entirely outside a biological womb for a portion of that developmental period. While the technology remains, as of published reporting, in animal trials and has not been approved for human use, the research team's own published statements, cited extensively in subsequent coverage by outlets, including the New York Times and Scientific American, described the eventual goal as extending viability for extremely premature human infants, a technology that, if successfully developed for human application, would represent a further, direct instance of the boundary between natural biological process and engineered intervention, dissolving in exactly the domain Enoch's ancient authors treated as most fundamentally fixed by design, human reproduction and gestation itself. This is the second sign. Ancient warning language about beings crossing fixed boundaries and teaching humanity forbidden arts, paired with a specific ancient description of that knowledge outpacing humanity's capacity to safely contain it, and a specific ancient warning about the corruption of heredity itself, producing consequences that propagate beyond a single generation, mapped against a documented, accelerating modern landscape spanning the first confirmed case of heritable human genome editing in 2018, the near universal international scientific condemnation that followed specifically because that modification would pass to future generations, synthetic media technology dissolving the boundary between authentic and fabricated human appearance and speech, and repeated, publicly signed statements from the very researchers and executives leading frontier artificial intelligence development, warning that their own creations may present risks comparable to pandemics and nuclear war. Like the first sign, this one is not a future possibility. Every example cited here, from the 1975 Asilomar Guidelines through the 2015 Washington Summit to the 2023 statements from OpenAI and Google DeepMind leadership, is already documented, dated, publicly recorded, and part of the historical record. The third sign moves from knowledge and biology to violence itself, and specifically to a claim about the scale and character of coming warfare that Enoch's authors could not have derived from any weapon technology available in their own era. Chapter 99 of the Epistle of Enoch describes a period of woe to those who work unrighteousness and support oppression and slay their neighbors until the day of the great judgment, language that on its own reads as generic ancient warning against violence, the kind of moral condemnation present across nearly all ancient religious literature. But chapter 100, in both Nib's and Isaac's translations, becomes considerably more specific, describing a coming period in which the father shall be smitten with his sons together, and brothers shall fall in death together until the streams flow with their blood, describing violence that crosses and dissolves the most fundamental social bonds, family units turning against each other, a marker the text uses elsewhere to signal a complete breakdown of social order rather than conventional warfare between distinct armies or nations. More specifically still, chapter 100 verse 2 describes a coming state in which a man shall not withhold his hand from his sons and his sons' sons to slay them, and the sinner shall not withhold his hand from his honored brother. Language, multiple scholars including Stuckenbrook, in his commentary on the epistle, have connected to a broader ancient Near Eastern apocalyptic motif describing warfare so total, so lacking in the conventional restraints ancient warfare typically observed even at its worst, that it produces a complete inversion of normal social bonds, a level of violence exceeding what the text's own contemporary readers would have understood conventional warfare, however brutal, to typically produce. To evaluate whether this specific claim, warfare of unprecedented scale and character rather than merely continued ordinary violence, which has of course persisted throughout every century of recorded history, maps onto a genuinely distinguishable modern condition, the historical data on warfare's changing character and lethality across centuries provides a useful and checkable frame. The distinction between conventional warfare, however brutal, and warfare capable of the kind of totalizing, boundary-dissolving violence chapter 100 describes, maps with considerable precision onto the emergence of weapons categorically different from anything available prior to the 20th century, specifically nuclear, and to a lesser extent chemical and biological, weapons capable of casualties and destruction on a scale that ancient and even early modern military technology simply could not produce, regardless of the scale of the conflict or the brutality of the combatants. The detonation of the first nuclear weapon used in warfare over Hiroshima, Japan, on the 6th of August 1945, followed 3 days later by the detonation of a second weapon over Nagasaki, represents, according to the U.S. Department of Energy's own historical documentation of the Manhattan Project and its aftermath, a categorical break in the history of human weapons technology. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation, a joint Japanese-American research institution established specifically to study the long-term health effects of the bombings on survivors, has published research over subsequent decades, documenting that the combined death toll from the two bombings, including deaths in the following months from acute radiation injuries, has been estimated at between 129,000 and 226,000 people, a range reflecting the significant documentation challenges involved in wartime casualty counting, but nonetheless representing a scale of destruction from two individual weapons that no prior conventional bombing campaign in human history had achieved. The scale of what followed the initial demonstration of this technology is where the third sign's specificity becomes most relevant. According to figures maintained by the Federation of American Scientists, a nonprofit research organization that has tracked global nuclear arsenals since the early Cold War period, the combined global stockpile of nuclear warheads peaked in 1986 at an estimated 70,300 weapons, held primarily by the United States and the Soviet Union, though the arsenal has since been substantially reduced through a series of bilateral and multilateral arms control agreements, standing at an estimated 12,512 warheads globally as of the Federation's most recent published assessment in 2024. Even at current reduced levels, nuclear weapons researchers, including work published by physicists at Princeton University's Program on Science and Global Security, have modeled the humanitarian consequences of a large-scale nuclear exchange between major nuclear powers and consistently found casualty projections reaching into the hundreds of millions when accounting for immediate blast effects, firestorms, and subsequent radiation exposure, a scale of potential violence with no precedent in any conflict prior to the nuclear era, and one capable, in the scenarios modeled by these researchers, of producing exactly the kind of total societal collapse Chapter 100's imagery of family bonds dissolving under violence would represent. Beyond the raw destructive capacity of nuclear weapons specifically, the character of warfare, more broadly, has undergone changes across the 20th and 21st centuries that researchers in the field of conflict studies describe using language remarkably close to Enoch's own imagery of violence, exceeding conventional bounds and dissolving normal social restraint. The concept of total war, warfare mobilizing an entire society's economic, industrial, and civilian population toward the war effort and treating civilian infrastructure and populations as legitimate military targets rather than protected non-combatants, is generally dated by military historians to have first fully emerged during the First World War, 1914 to 1918, and reached its most extreme expression during the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. According to figures compiled by demographic historians studying the Second World War's casualty patterns, including work published in the Cambridge History of the Second World War, edited by Michael Geyer and Adam Tooze, and published by Cambridge University Press in 2015, an estimated 70 to 85 million people died as a direct or indirect result of the conflict, representing at the time roughly 3% of the entire global population, a scale and proportion of casualties without precedent in any prior recorded conflict in human history, and one achieved specifically because industrialized warfare had by that point developed the capacity to target and kill civilian populations at a scale through strategic bombing campaigns, blockade-induced famine, and systematic genocide that no prior era's weapons technology could achieve, regardless of the intent or brutality. The combatants involved, the specific detail in Chapter 100 describing fathers and sons dying together, brothers turning against each other, deserves one further layer of scholarly context. Dr. Stuckenbrook's commentary connects this imagery to a broader apocalyptic tradition, appearing also in later Jewish and early Christian texts, including passages in the Synoptic Gospels, describing the complete breakdown of family loyalty and social trust as a specific marker distinguishing the final period from ordinary historical conflict, ordinary warfare between distinct political or tribal groups that, however brutal, generally preserved family and kinship loyalty as a stable unit, even amid conflict between larger groups. Total, industrialized warfare, and specifically the phenomena of civil war and internal societal collapse that frequently accompany or follow major industrialized conflicts, produce precisely the kind of family and community-level breakdown the text describes. Combatants and civilians alike, drawn into violence that crosses and dissolves the kinship bonds that had previously remained stable even during more limited, conventional warfare between organized armies. The 20th century alone provides multiple documented instances of exactly this pattern at scale. The Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922, following the collapse of the Russian Empire, produced documented instances of family members fighting on opposing sides of the conflict, a phenomenon extensively documented in historical scholarship on the period, including Orlando Figuez's widely cited history, A People's Tragedy, published by Penguin in 1996. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, similarly produced well-documented cases of families divided along ideological lines, fighting and in some cases executing family members on opposing sides, a pattern of violence historian Paul Preston has extensively documented in his research on the conflict's civilian casualties, including his 2012 study, The Spanish Holocaust, published by Harper Press. More recently, ongoing conflicts, including the Syrian Civil War, which the United Nations Human Rights Office has documented since 2011 as having produced casualty figures exceeding 300,000 confirmed deaths as of the office's most recent comprehensive assessment, have similarly produced extensively documented instances of this same pattern. Communities and families fractured along sectarian and political lines, turning against each other in ways that dissolve the kinship bonds. Ancient warfare, even at its most brutal, generally left intact between combatants who remained bound by shared tribal or family loyalty even while at war with outside groups. There is a further dimension to the third sign, one that connects directly back to the second sign's warning about forbidden knowledge, because Chapter 65 of the Dream Visions material explicitly links the coming violence to the same corrupted teaching described in Chapters 7 and 8, describing an angel telling Noah that the earth's coming destruction stems specifically from the arts the Watchers taught, not from ordinary human wickedness operating with ordinary human means. The text draws a direct causal line between forbidden knowledge and the scale of violence that knowledge makes possible, a line that maps with unusual precision onto the actual documented history of how nuclear weapons technology came into being. The Manhattan Project, the United States government program that developed the first nuclear weapons during the Second World War, drew directly on theoretical physics breakthroughs that had emerged only decades earlier. Albert Einstein's mass energy equivalence formulation, published in 1905, and the subsequent development of nuclear fission theory, first experimentally demonstrated by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in Berlin in December 1938, with the theoretical explanation provided shortly after by Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch. According to the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of History and Heritage Resources, which maintains extensive public documentation of the Manhattan Project's development, the entire span from the first experimental demonstration of nuclear fission to the detonation of a working weapon spanned less than 7 years, an extraordinarily compressed timeline by the standards of most weapons technology development throughout prior human history, during which flintlock to breech loading rifle technology, for comparison, took centuries to develop through comparatively gradual, incremental improvement. This compression, knowledge translating into world-altering weapons capability within a single scientist's working career rather than across generations, is precisely the acceleration pattern, the second sign, documented in the context of information and biotechnology, and its appearance here in the specific context of weapons capable of the kind of total, boundary-dissolving violence. Chapter 100 describes, reinforces, rather than contradicts the pattern Enoch's authors identified, that the same underlying condition, knowledge multiplying and spreading faster than the wisdom needed to govern its consequences, produces destructive potential at the same accelerating rate across every domain it touches, not merely violence considered in isolation. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a non-profit organization founded in 1945 by scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project itself, including several who subsequently became vocal advocates for nuclear arms control, has maintained since 1947 a symbolic doomsday clock, a publicly updated assessment of how close the organization's Science and Security Board judges humanity to be to catastrophic, potentially civilization-ending destruction, weighted heavily, though not exclusively, toward nuclear risk in its original formulation, and expanded in subsequent decades to incorporate climate change and, more recently, disruptive technologies, including artificial intelligence and biotechnology. In January 2023, the Bulletin's board set the clock at 90 seconds to midnight. According to the organization's own published statement, the closest the assessment has ever been set to midnight since the clock's creation in 1947, citing specifically the war in Ukraine and what the board's statement described as increased nuclear risk alongside continuing climate and biological threats. That assessment was maintained at 90 seconds to midnight in the Bulletin's January 2024 update as well. According to the organization's published statement for that year, representing the most severe sustained risk assessment the organization, founded specifically by the scientists who built the weapons. Chapter 100's imagery echoes with such precision has ever issued across its entire 77-year publication history. Beyond nuclear weapons specifically, the broader category of weapons capable of mass, indiscriminate casualties, what military and arms control literature terms weapons of mass destruction, encompassing chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear categories collectively, has expanded considerably since the mid-20th century, despite extensive international treaty efforts to constrain their development and use. The Chemical Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1997 and is administered by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, based in The Hague, has, according to the organization's own published verification reports, overseen the destruction of over 99% of declared chemical weapons stockpiles among its member states as of its most recent comprehensive reporting, a genuine and substantial achievement in arms control. Yet the same organization's published incident reports document confirmed chemical weapons use in the Syrian civil war on multiple occasions between 2013 and 2018, findings independently corroborated by the OPCW's own fact-finding mission and, in several instances, its investigation and identification team established specifically to attribute responsibility for confirmed chemical attacks, demonstrating that even weapons categories subject to among the most successful arms control regimes in modern history continue to see documented use in ongoing conflicts. Precisely the combination the ancient text warns of, weapons capability racing ahead of humanity's collective capacity, even when genuinely well-organized and well-intentioned, to fully contain the consequences of knowledge once it has been released into circulation. One additional historical marker deserves inclusion here, because it addresses a specific objection researchers of ancient apocalyptic literature frequently raise, whether generic warnings about coming violence should count as fulfilled prophecy at all. Given that warfare has been a constant feature of every century of recorded human history without exception, the answer, according to the specific quantitative work done by conflict researchers rather than impressionistic historical narrative, is that the 20th century represents not merely a continuation of historical violence but a measurable statistical outlier. Steven Pinker, the Harvard University psychologist whose 2011 book The Better Angels of Our Nature, published by Viking, remains among the most extensively cited quantitative studies of long-term violence trends, compiled casualty data across recorded history, and found that, measured as a proportion of global population rather than raw numbers, several individual conflicts and periods prior to the 20th century, including the Mongol conquests of the 13th century and the An Lushan Rebellion in 8th century China, produced comparably severe proportional casualties. Pinker's broader thesis, that violence has declined proportionally over the long arc of history, has drawn substantial scholarly engagement and some direct challenge, including from Bear Braumweller of Ohio State University, whose 2019 book Only the Dead, published by Oxford University Press, argued using a different statistical methodology that the apparent decline in interstate war frequency does not necessarily indicate a corresponding decline in war's severity when conflicts do occur, and that the destructive capacity available in modern warfare, even if deployed less frequently, remains categorically higher than in any prior era, specifically because of the weapons technology now available. This scholarly debate matters for evaluating the third sign because it clarifies precisely what claim is and is not being made. The claim is not that violence itself is new. Ancient societies were entirely capable of extraordinary brutality using the weapons available to them, nor that the 20th century saw more individual conflicts than history has otherwise produced. The claim, consistent with Braumweller's statistical findings, and directly supported by the raw casualty and destructive capacity figures already cited, is that the character and technological ceiling of violence changed categorically with the arrival of industrialized total war and nuclear weapons, producing a destructive potential per conflict, and in several documented 20th century cases, a destructive reality per conflict, that no prior era's weapons technology, regardless of the brutality or scale of the societies wielding it, could physically achieve. That is the specific, checkable historical claim Chapter 100's imagery of total, boundary-dissolving violence maps onto, and it is a claim quantitative conflict researchers working from primary casualty data, not impressionistic historical narrative, have independently converged on despite disagreement over the broader long-term trend in violence frequency. One further category of modern weapons development deserves inclusion here, because it represents a domain of military technology developing at a pace that closely mirrors the compressed timeline already documented in the nuclear case. Autonomous weapons systems, military hardware capable of selecting and engaging targets without direct, real-time human control, have moved within roughly a single decade from largely theoretical discussion within military strategy literature to documented battlefield deployment. A 2021 report submitted to the United Nations Security Council by an independent panel of experts monitoring the conflict in Libya, and subsequently reported by outlets including The New Scientist and Reuters, described what the panel's own report characterized as a likely first documented instance of an autonomous drone system. A Turkish-made Kargu 2 model, engaging human targets without a direct human command authorizing the specific attack, a capability that, if the panel's assessment is accurate, represents a threshold in weapons autonomy that international humanitarian law scholars, including work published by the International Committee of the Red Cross, have specifically flagged as raising unresolved questions the existing laws of armed conflict were not designed to address. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, an independent research institute that has tracked global military expenditure and arms transfers since 1966, reported in its most recent published annual assessment that global military spending reached approximately $2.4 trillion in 2023. The ninth consecutive year of increase, according to the Institute's own published trend data, occurring specifically during the same period in which autonomous and AI-enabled weapon systems have transitioned from experimental prototype to documented operational deployment, a convergence between rapidly escalating spending and rapidly advancing capability that mirrors, at a scale the ancient text's authors could not have anticipated in its technical specifics, the same underlying pattern Chapter 100 describes weapons capability advancing in step with, and arguably faster than, humanity's capacity to establish clear ethical and legal boundaries governing its use. This is the third sign. Ancient language describing a coming period of warfare so total that it dissolves the most basic bonds of family and kinship, exceeding anything conventional warfare between organized armies typically produces, explicitly linked in the text itself to the same corrupted knowledge described in the second sign, mapped against the documented emergence of nuclear weapons technology in 1945. Developed within a compressed 7-year span from fission's initial theoretical discovery, capable of casualties and destruction with no precedent in prior human history, a global nuclear arsenal that peaked at over 70,000 warheads and remains, even at current reduced levels, capable, according to peer-reviewed modeling, of producing casualties in the hundreds of millions in a large-scale exchange. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist's own sustained 90 seconds to midnight assessment, representing the most severe risk rating in its 77-year history, documented chemical weapons use in ongoing conflicts despite advanced international arms control regimes and repeated, extensively documented instances across multiple 20th and 21st century conflicts of violence, specifically dissolving family and kinship bonds in the precise pattern the ancient text describes. Like the first two signs, this one is not speculative. Every weapon, every casualty figure, and every documented instance of family-level violence cited here is drawn from published historical and demographic research, checkable against primary sources maintained by the institutions named. Before we move on to the next sign, stop for a second. What you just heard about the third marker is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original GEE's passage. The exact wording, the precise conjunction date, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The fourth sign shifts from human violence to the natural world itself, and it opens with one of the more startling passages in the entire Enochic corpus, because it presents the Earth not as a passive backdrop to human events, but as a witness capable of registering and reporting what has been done to it. Chapter 7, verse 6, describes the Earth itself laying accusation against the lawless ones, and Chapter 9, verse 2, has the archangels reporting to the Most High that the earth made complaint, that the cry of their voice reaches to the gates of heaven. Chapter 84, part of a prayer attributed to Enoch himself in the Dream Visions section, extends this theme, addressing God directly with language, describing the earth as having been made to suffer specific violence and corruption at the hands of those living on it. This is not incidental poetic imagery. Across multiple independently authored sections of the composite text, The Earth is repeatedly personified as a party capable of registering harm and calling for judgment because of what has been done to it. The astronomical book adds a further, more technical layer to this fourth sign, chapter 80 again, providing the relevant passage describing a coming period in which the entire order of the stars will be concealed from the sinners, and the thoughts of those on the earth will err concerning them, and they will be altered from all their ways. Language, multiple scholars, including Vanderkam, have read as describing a broader disruption to the natural, observable order the text elsewhere treats as fixed by design, a disruption extending beyond celestial observation into the Earth's own systems and cycles. Dr. Nickelsburg's commentary situates this fourth sign within a broader ancient Near Eastern literary tradition of the land itself suffering and crying out because of human sin, a motif that appears earlier in the Hebrew Bible itself, most explicitly in Genesis chapter 4, where God tells Cain that his brother's blood cries out from the ground, and in the prophetic literature, including Isaiah chapter 24, which describes the earth as defiled by its inhabitants, having transgressed the laws and broken the everlasting covenant. Enoch's authors are drawing on and extending an established theological vocabulary, but doing so with unusual specificity about mechanism, the earth registering and communicating harm through observable, describable means, rather than through purely symbolic or metaphorical suffering. To evaluate this fourth sign against the modern historical and scientific record requires examining a body of evidence that, unlike the previous three signs, spans not decades but an accumulating scientific consensus built across more than a century of direct measurement, and that measurement record shows the Earth's fundamental systems, its atmosphere, its oceans, its cryosphere, and its biosphere, registering disruption at a rate and scale that the scientific community itself, working entirely independently of any theological framework, has repeatedly described using language of alarm typically reserved for genuine emergency conditions rather than routine environmental variation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, established in 1988 under the joint auspices of the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program, specifically to provide policymakers with regular, comprehensive, and rigorously peer-reviewed scientific assessments of climate change, released its sixth assessment report across 2021 and 2022, representing the synthesized work of hundreds of scientists reviewing tens of thousands of published studies. The report's summary for policymakers states, in language the panel's own consensus-based drafting process treats as carrying the highest confidence rating available in its assessment framework that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and that widespread and rapid changes have occurred in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere. The specific numbers behind that assessment are worth stating plainly, because they represent measured, instrumentally recorded data rather than projection or modeling. According to NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which maintains one of several independently verified global surface temperature datasets, alongside the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the UK Met Office's Hadley Centre, global average surface temperature has risen by approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial baseline as of the most recent complete annual assessment, with the 10 warmest years in the entire instrumental record extending back to 1880, all occurring within the most recent decade, a statistical concentration that would be extraordinarily improbable under conditions of stable, unchanging climate. The oceans, which absorb the overwhelming majority of the additional heat generated by this warming, according to research published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's own Ocean Heat Content Monitoring Program, have registered this heat uptake with enough precision that scientists can track it as a direct, physical measurement, not an inference. A 2023 study published in the journal Advances in Atmospheric Sciences, authored by an international team led by Li-Jing Cheng of the Institute of Atmospheric Physics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, found that global ocean heat content reached a new record high in 2022, continuing an unbroken pattern of year-over-year increases, the study's authors described as consistent with a clear and unambiguous warming trend extending across every ocean basin measured. The cryosphere, the Earth's ice-covered regions, provides some of the most visually and quantitatively stark evidence available. The National Snow and Ice Data Center, based at the University of Colorado Boulder and funded primarily through NASA and the National Science Foundation, has maintained continuous satellite monitoring of Arctic sea ice extent since 1979, and its published data record shows that the September Arctic sea ice minimum, the point each year when the ice cover reaches its smallest annual extent, has declined at a rate the center's own published analysis describes as approximately 12.2% per decade relative to the 1981 to 2010 average, with the years since 2007 including nearly every one of the lowest sea ice extents ever recorded in the entire satellite era. The Greenland ice sheet, according to research published in the journal Nature by an international team of over 90 polar scientists working under the Ice Sheet Mass Balance Intercomparison exercise in 2020, is losing mass at a rate the study found had increased sevenfold between the 1990s and the 2010s, a rate of acceleration, not merely continuation, that the study's authors explicitly noted was tracking the upper bound of projections previously considered worst-case scenarios by the IPCC's own earlier assessment reports. Beyond temperature and ice, the fourth sign's imagery of the Earth crying out under specific harm finds a further, more direct parallel in the documented state of ocean chemistry itself. Research compiled by the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, a partnership of research institutions coordinated through the International Atomic Energy Agency's Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center, has documented that ocean surface pH has declined by approximately 0.1 units since the beginning of the industrial era, a figure that, because pH is measured on a logarithmic scale, represents an approximately 30% increase in ocean acidity, driven directly by the ocean's absorption of roughly a quarter of all carbon dioxide emitted by human industrial activity, according to figures published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Ocean Acidification Program. This is, in the most literal, chemically measurable sense available to modern science, an alteration of the ocean's fundamental composition directly attributable to human industrial activity, precisely the kind of registered, measurable harm to the natural world the Earth's complaint in chapters 7 and 9 describes in ancient theological language. The biosphere, the totality of living systems on Earth, registers this same disruption through a different but equally well-documented metric, species loss and ecosystem disruption occurring at a rate multiple major scientific assessments have described using explicitly alarmed language. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, an independent intergovernmental body established in 2012 and endorsed by the United Nations Environment Assembly, released its Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in 2019, the most comprehensive assessment of its kind ever conducted, drawing on the work of hundreds of expert authors, reviewing approximately 15,000 scientific and government sources. The assessment's own summary for policymakers, again representing the highest confidence consensus language the panel's process allows, states that around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades, more than at any time in human history, a finding the panel's chair, Sir Robert Watson, described in the assessment's public release materials as showing that the health of ecosystems on which humanity and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. There is a further layer to this fourth sign worth drawing out specifically, because Enoch's language does not simply describe general environmental degradation in the modern sense. It describes something closer to a system under sufficient stress that its normal, predictable patterns become disrupted and unreliable, precisely the language climate scientists themselves now use when discussing the increasing frequency of extreme weather events departing from historical baseline patterns. A 2023 attribution study published in the journal Environmental Research Letters by researchers affiliated with World Weather Attribution, an international scientific collaboration that develops rapid assessments of whether specific extreme weather events can be statistically linked to human-caused climate change, found that the majority of extreme heat events studied across the preceding decade would have been, in the study's own words, extremely unlikely to occur in a climate unaltered by human greenhouse gas emissions, providing a direct, event-by-event, peer-reviewed link between specific documented instances of the Earth's weather patterns departing from historical stability and the underlying human industrial activity, the ancient text's imagery of the Earth crying out under harm caused by those living on it seems, in modern scientific vocabulary, to describe with unsettling, structural precision. There is a specific detail in chapter 100, verse 11, that connects this fourth sign directly back to the earlier signs already covered, and it concerns the Earth's atmosphere specifically. The verse describes clouds and mist and dew and rain being withheld in a coming period of judgment, Language Nickelsburg's commentary reads alongside the broader epistle's warnings about disrupted natural cycles as part of the same complex of signs. A natural world whose normal patterns of provision, rainfall, seasonal predictability, atmospheric behavior become unreliable specifically as a consequence of the same corruption the earlier chapters attribute to forbidden knowledge and its violent consequences. The modern scientific record on precipitation pattern disruption provides an unusually direct point of comparison here, because unlike temperature, which trends in a single, relatively straightforward direction, precipitation disruption manifests as increased volatility and unpredictability in both directions. Simultaneously, a pattern climate scientists describe using the specific term precipitation whiplash, referring to increasingly rapid swings between drought and extreme flooding within the same region. A 2022 study published in the journal Nature Climate Change, led by Daniel Swain of the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Nature Conservancy of California, found that this specific whiplash pattern, rapid transitions between very dry and very wet conditions, has already increased across most of the globe due to human-caused warming, and is projected by the study's modeling to increase further, with the western United States identified as a region already experiencing some of the most severe documented transitions, including the sequence of extreme drought conditions across 2020 through 2022, followed by record-breaking atmospheric river-driven flooding in the winter of 2022 to 2023. A sequence that California's own Department of Water Resources documented in its official post-event assessment as representing one of the most extreme wet-to-dry-to-wet transitions in the state's entire instrumental precipitation record, extending back over a century. The specific mechanism behind this increased volatility, according to the atmospheric physics explained in the IPCC's 6th assessment report, follows directly and predictably from the same warming already documented, because warmer air holds more moisture, a relationship governed by the well-established Clausius-Clapeyron equation from 19th century thermodynamics, meaning that when conditions are wet, warmer air can produce more extreme rainfall, and when conditions are dry, warmer air draws moisture more aggressively from soil and vegetation, deepening drought. The result, as the World Meteorological Organization's own State of the Global Climate reports have documented in successive annual editions since the mid-2010s, is a global pattern of both drought and flood events becoming simultaneously more frequent, more intense, and less predictable. Precisely the disruption to reliable, expected natural provision that Chapter 100's imagery of withheld rain and clouds describes. The broader category of what insurance and disaster response literature terms billion-dollar weather and climate disasters provides one further, directly quantifiable measure of this disruption. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration maintains a continuously updated public database tracking weather and climate disasters in the United States alone that have caused damages exceeding $1 billion, adjusted for inflation, and its published data shows that while the 1980s averaged approximately 3 such events per year, the most recent 5-year period on record, according to NOAA's own published summary statistics, has averaged over 20 such events annually, a nearly 7-fold increase, occurring during a period in which the underlying value of insured property and infrastructure has grown far more slowly than the disaster frequency itself, indicating the increase reflects a genuine change in the frequency and severity of extreme events, rather than merely more expensive property being exposed to a constant background rate of disaster. One final strand of evidence for this fourth sign concerns a category of disruption Enoch's authors could not have possessed any vocabulary for at all: subterranean and deep ocean processes entirely invisible to any observer working without modern instrumentation. And yet, the general pattern the text describes, an Earth whose deep, normally stable systems become disturbed and register that disturbance, has an unexpectedly direct parallel here as well. The Global Seismographic Network, a partnership between the United States Geological Survey and the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, has maintained continuous, standardized global earthquake monitoring since the 1980s, providing a dataset of unprecedented completeness compared to any prior era of seismic recording. The USGS's own published catalog does not show an increase in the underlying rate of tectonic earthquake activity itself, a finding worth stating plainly because it demonstrates this fourth sign is not being stretched to fit every possible category of natural event indiscriminately. Tectonic seismicity remains, according to the agency's own assessment, statistically consistent with long-term historical rates once modern detection capability is accounted for. But a separate and specifically human-linked category, induced seismicity, Earthquakes triggered by human industrial activity, including wastewater injection associated with oil and gas extraction, has shown a documented and dramatic increase in specific regions. A study published in the journal Science in 2018 by researchers including Cornelius Langenbroek and William Ellsworth of Stanford University found that the state of Oklahoma, which had historically experienced fewer than 2 magnitude 3 or greater earthquakes per year prior to 2009, recorded over 900 such earthquakes in 2015 alone, an increase the study's authors attributed with high confidence to wastewater injection practices associated with expanded oil and gas operations in the region, a direct, measurable instance of subterranean systems registering disturbance specifically as a consequence of human industrial activity, the deep earth responding, in the most literal, instrumentally recorded sense available, to what has been done to it from above. The deep ocean shows a parallel pattern through the lens of deoxygenation, the depletion of dissolved oxygen in ocean waters that marine life depends on. Research published in 2019 inches the journal Diversity and Distributions and in subsequent syntheses coordinated through the Global Ocean Oxygen Network, a working group established under the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization's Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, found that the ocean's oxygen content has declined by approximately 2% globally since the middle of the 20th century, with the volume of ocean water experiencing severe oxygen depletion, functionally uninhabitable for most marine life in areas researchers term dead zones, having quadrupled since 1950 according to the network's own published synthesis. The mechanism, again traceable directly to human industrial activity through both warming-driven reduced oxygen solubility and agricultural runoff-driven eutrophication, represents a further, independently documented instance of the Earth's deep systems, waters far below any surface observation, registering measurable harm from processes originating in human activity on land. One further category of evidence rounds out this fourth sign, and it concerns a specific, single number that climate scientists treat as a critical threshold rather than merely one data point among many. The Paris Agreement, adopted by nearly every nation on Earth at the 21st Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in December 2015, established as its central target limiting global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with an aspirational target of limiting the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius specifically. According to the World Meteorological Organization's own published State of the Global Climate Update for 2023, that year's global average temperature reached approximately 1.45 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline, placing the planet, according to the organization's own assessment, within a narrow margin of the aspirational threshold the international community had specifically identified as the point beyond which the risk of what climate science literature terms irreversible tipping points, self-reinforcing changes to major Earth systems that would continue independent of any subsequent human intervention, increases substantially. The specific tipping points climate scientists have identified through peer-reviewed research, compiled comprehensively in a widely cited 2022 assessment published in the journal Science by an international team led by David Armstrong McKay of the University of Exeter, include the collapse of major ice sheets, the dieback of the Amazon rainforest, and the disruption of major ocean circulation patterns, including the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, a system of ocean currents that regulates climate patterns across the entire North Atlantic region. That same study's own risk assessment found that several of these tipping points could be triggered within the currently observed warming range, rather than requiring warming to reach the more severe upper bound scenarios earlier climate models had treated as the primary threshold of concern, a finding the study's authors described as indicating the risk had been underestimated in prior assessment cycles, precisely the kind of unexpected acceleration in the Earth's own registered response to harm that chapters 7 and 9's ancient personification of a suffering, complaining Earth anticipates in its own theological vocabulary. A final, brief note on methodology before closing this fourth sign. Every institution cited throughout, NASA, NOAA, the IPCC, the IPBES, the National Snow and Ice Data Center, operates under a mandate of scientific measurement entirely disconnected from any theological question whatsoever, funded and staffed to answer physical questions about temperature, ice extent, ocean chemistry, and species population, not to evaluate ancient prophetic literature. That the resulting, independently gathered data happens to align so consistently with an ancient text's own specific language of a suffering, Complaining Earth is precisely the kind of convergence this documentary has asked its viewers to weigh with care throughout, neither dismissed nor overstated, but placed plainly on the record for each viewer's own consideration. This is the fourth sign, ancient personification of the Earth itself, registering and crying out against harm done to it, extending across chapters 7, 9, 84, and 100 of a text composed by different authors across different centuries, specifically including a warning about disrupted rainfall and withheld natural provision, mapped against a modern scientific consensus, built from over a century of direct instrumental measurement and synthesized through the rigorous peer review process of bodies including the IPCC, NOAA, NASA, and the IPBES, documenting measurable, accelerating disruption across the atmosphere, the oceans, the cryosphere, and the biosphere simultaneously, including a documented, quantified increase in precisely the kind of precipitation volatility and withheld or excessive rainfall the ancient text describes. Disruption, the scientific community's own consensus assessments, describe, independent of any theological framework, as unprecedented in the historical and paleoclimate record and directly attributable to human industrial activity. Like the first three signs, this one is not speculative. Every figure cited here is drawn from published, peer-reviewed research and the official assessment reports of the world's leading scientific bodies. The fifth sign moves in a different direction from the previous four. Where the first four signs describe conditions of corruption and disruption, chapters 89 and 90 of the Book of Dream Visions describe a specific reversal, a scattering of a particular people across the earth followed by a specific, describable regathering, and the text is unusually precise about both halves of this pattern. The Dream Vision section retells the biblical history of Israel using an extended animal allegory, sheep representing the people of Israel, with various other animals representing surrounding nations and empires. Chapter 89 describes the sheep being scattered and given over to wild beasts, wolves, lions, and other predatory animals representing successive conquering empires, a symbolic retelling scholars, including Dr. Patrick Tiller, in his 1993 study A Commentary on the Animal Apocalypse of 1 Enoch published by Scholars Press, have mapped in detail against the actual documented history of Israelite and Jewish exile. First, the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom in 722 before the Common Era, then the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom and the destruction of the First Temple in 586 before the Common Era, followed by subsequent Persian, Hellenistic, and eventually Roman domination. What makes this fifth sign specifically relevant to the modern era, rather than simply a historical retelling of events already completed by the time of Enoch's composition, is chapter 90, which extends the allegory beyond the historical scatterings the author had already witnessed and describes a coming regathering, the sheep eventually being brought back and reestablished, with the text using specific imagery of a new house being built for them, larger and loftier than the first, language multiple scholars, including Nickelsburg, have connected to a broader Second Temple period. Hope for national restoration extending beyond the more limited historical return under Persian sponsorship that had already occurred by the likely composition date of this section, generally placed by scholars including Tiller in the mid-2nd century before the Common Era, during or shortly after the Maccabean Revolt. The specific detail that distinguishes this as a marker worth examining against the modern historical record, rather than simply describing hope for restoration in a generic sense common to much ancient Jewish literature, is the scale and totality the text describes. Chapter 90 describes essentially the entire scattered flock eventually being gathered, not a partial remnant, into a singular restored condition, a claim of comprehensive rather than partial regathering that sets a higher, more specific bar for what would count as fulfillment than simple continued Jewish presence in the land of Israel, which had in fact persisted in unbroken, if numerically reduced, form throughout the entire period of foreign domination the text describes. The documented historical trajectory of Jewish population distribution and return to the land of Israel across the nearly 2,000 years, following the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, an event that occurred after the composition of the Animal Apocalypse but that later Jewish and Christian readers, and the text's own subsequent transmission history within communities that experienced this destruction, would have understood as a further, even more severe iteration of the scattering the text describes, provides the relevant data against which to evaluate this fifth sign. Following the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 of the Common Era, Roman authorities under Hadrian renamed the province Syria, Palestina, and, according to historical demographic estimates compiled by scholars including Sala Whitmire Barron in his multi-volume Social and Religious History of the Jews, published by Columbia University Press across multiple editions between 1952 and 1983, the Jewish population of the land of Israel entered a period of sustained numerical decline relative to the surrounding region. While Jewish communities became established and in some cases flourished across an increasingly wide geographic diaspora spanning the Roman and later Byzantine and Persian empires, then extending further across the medieval period into Islamic Spain, into Ashkenazi communities across northern and eastern Europe, and eventually across nearly every populated continent, a dispersion of remarkable geographic breadth documented extensively in Jewish demographic and historical scholarship. The reversal of this two-millennia trajectory, a documented, statistically measurable return migration to the land of Israel specifically, is where this fifth sign's modern relevance becomes most concrete and checkable. The Zionist movement, formally organized following the First Zionist Congress convened by Theodor Herzl in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, initiated a sustained pattern of Jewish immigration to the region, then known as Ottoman and later British Mandate Palestine, documented in successive waves scholars term aliyat, the Hebrew term for ascent, used specifically for immigration to the land of Israel. According to figures compiled by Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, the government agency responsible for official demographic record-keeping, the Jewish population of the land grew from an estimated 24,000 inches, 1,882, at the beginning of the first Aliyah, to approximately 650,000 by the time of Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948, a period during which the total global Jewish population had simultaneously suffered catastrophic loss through the Holocaust, the systematic genocide carried out by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1941 and 1945, which the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's own published historical documentation estimates killed approximately 6 million Jews, roughly two-thirds of the pre-war European Jewish population, making the subsequent scale of return migration to Israel following 1948 all the more numerically significant relative to the reduced global Jewish population from which that migration drew. Following 1948, according to Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics published historical immigration data, sustained waves of immigration continued across subsequent decades, including large-scale organized immigration from Middle Eastern and North African Jewish communities during the 1950s, from the Soviet Union and its successor states beginning in the late 1980s and accelerating dramatically following the Soviet collapse in 1991, bringing over 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union to Israel across the following decade, according to the Bureau's figures, and from Ethiopia, including the specific government-coordinated Operation Moses in 1984 and Operation Solomon in 1991, which the Israeli government's own published historical accounts describe as having airlifted approximately 8,000 and 14,000 Ethiopian Jews respectively, within extraordinarily compressed operational timeframes. In the case of Operation Solomon accomplishing the transport within a single 36-hour period, according to Israeli Air Force operational records. The cumulative statistical result of this century and a half-long pattern of return migration is that, according to Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics' most recent published population estimates, the Jewish population of Israel now stands at over 7 million people, representing, according to demographic analysis published by the Jewish Agency for Israel and cross-referenced against global Jewish population estimates compiled by the Berman Jewish Data Bank, a research initiative based at Brandeis University, the largest single national concentration of Jewish population anywhere in the world, a status that historical demographic data indicates had not been true for any single geographic location since at least the period immediately following the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, and by some demographic reconstructions not since significantly earlier still. Dr. Tiller's commentary on the animal apocalypse addresses directly the question of how completely the text's regathering language should be read, noting that the author writing in the mid-2nd century before the Common Era was almost certainly envisioning restoration in terms available to his own historical moment, a return comparable in character to the Persian-sponsored return under Cyrus described in the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, rather than anticipating the specific, much later, much larger scale return migration that would occur following the 20th century's establishment of a modern Israeli state. This scholarly caution is important and should be stated plainly rather than glossed over. The ancient author's own intended referent for his prophecy was very likely a different, earlier historical restoration than the one this documentary is drawing the comparison to. What nonetheless makes this fifth sign worth including in a comprehensive treatment of Enoch's end times material is the specific language of comprehensiveness and scale that chapter 90 uses, describing a house larger and loftier than the first, and an essentially total regathering, language that, whatever the original author's specific historical referent, describes a pattern of scale and totality that the documented return migration since 1882, and especially since 1948, is the only period in the entire 2,000-year span since the text's composition that comes close to matching in raw demographic terms a modern Jewish population concentration in the land of Israel exceeding, according to the demographic sources already cited, any point in the documented historical record since antiquity, achieved through a sustained, multi-wave immigration pattern spanning over 14 decades and drawing Jewish communities from every populated continent on Earth back to a single geographic point of origin. There is a further detail in chapter 90 worth examining closely, because the text does not stop at describing regathering alone. It pairs the regathering with a second, related image, the transformation of the sheep themselves, described in the vision's closing verses as becoming white, with the text describing a great sword being given to the sheep and a subsequent transformation in which, in Tiller's translation, all of them became white bulls, a shift in the animal symbolism itself that scholars including Nickelsburg read as signaling a change in fundamental character or status accompanying the physical regathering, not merely a return to a previous geographic location, but an accompanying transformation the text treats as significant enough to mark with a change in the underlying symbolic species used throughout the vision. This detail matters for a full accounting of the fifth sign because it distinguishes the prophecy from a purely geographic or demographic claim. The text describes not simply Jewish population returning to a specific territory, which is already documented has occurred at unprecedented historical scale, but a broader transformation accompanying that return. Modern Israeli history offers a further, specific data point relevant to this transformation dimension, the revival of Hebrew itself as a spoken vernacular language, a linguistic achievement without clear precedent in recorded history. Hebrew had functioned for roughly 18 centuries prior to the late 19th century primarily as a liturgical and scholarly language, used in prayer, religious study, and rabbinic literature, but not as anyone's native spoken tongue in daily life. With Jewish communities across the diaspora speaking the vernacular languages of their host societies, or distinct Jewish languages including Yiddish and Ladino, as their primary means of daily communication. Eliezer ben Yehuda, a Lithuanian-born Hebrew language advocate who immigrated to Ottoman Palestine in 1881, is credited by linguistic historians, including Jack Fellman in his 1973 study The Revival of a Classical Tongue published by Mouton, as the central figure driving the deliberate, systematic revival of Hebrew as a living, spoken vernacular language, an effort that included coining thousands of new Hebrew words for modern concepts the ancient and medieval language had no vocabulary for, compiling the first modern comprehensive Hebrew dictionary, and, according to accounts preserved in his own published memoirs and corroborated by subsequent linguistic historians, raising his own son as reportedly the first native Hebrew speaker in approximately 1,800 years. The Academy of the Hebrew Language, established by Israeli law in 1953 as the successor to Ben Yehuda's earlier language committee and continuing to serve as the official governing body for Hebrew language standards, describes, on its own published institutional history, the subsequent spread of spoken Hebrew across the Zionist immigrant communities of the early 20th century and its establishment as the primary official language of the State of Israel upon independence in 1948, a linguistic transformation that Fellman's and subsequent linguistic scholarship, including work by Gilad Zuckerman of the University of Adelaide, has described as essentially unprecedented. No other language in recorded history had been revived from purely liturgical and scholarly use to full native vernacular status across an entire national population within the span of a few generations. According to Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, Hebrew is now the native first language of the substantial majority of Israel's Jewish population, a linguistic transformation accompanying the demographic regathering already documented, arguably providing a modern, checkable parallel to the specific detail in Chapter 90 describing not merely a return, but an accompanying change in fundamental character, marked by the shift in the vision's own symbolic vocabulary from sheep to white bulls. Dr. Tiller's commentary, along with subsequent scholarly treatments of the animal apocalypse, including Dr. Daniel Olson's 2004 monograph Enoch, a new translation, published by North American Papers for the Study of Religion, note that the text's authors were almost certainly working within a framework anticipating a divinely orchestrated, relatively rapid restoration, rather than the drawn-out, multi-wave, century-and-a-half-long process of return migration actually documented in modern Israeli demographic history. This distinction matters for intellectual honesty in evaluating the sign, and it is worth stating clearly that the ancient text's own internal timeline expectations do not straightforwardly match the extended, incremental character of the actual historical return that occurred. What the fifth sign demonstrates, with the appropriate scholarly caution both Tiller and Olson bring to the material, is not a perfect one-to-one prophetic match on every specific detail of pacing and mechanism, but a striking correspondence on the core, defining claim, a scattered people achieving, after millennia of dispersion across every populated continent, a documented, demographically unprecedented regathering into a single restored homeland, accompanied by a linguistic and cultural transformation. The text's own shift in symbolic imagery from sheep to white bulls appears to anticipate in its own ancient vocabulary. One further comparative data point strengthens the specific claim of demographic unprecedents made above. The Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan American research organization that conducts extensive demographic surveys of global religious populations, published a comprehensive global Jewish population study in 2021 examining Jewish demographic distribution across every major world region. That study found that Israel and the United States together now account for the substantial majority of the global Jewish population, with Israel alone, according to the study's figures cross-referenced against the Central Bureau of Statistics data already cited, having surpassed the United States as the single largest national Jewish population sometime during the early 21st century. A crossing point, the Jewish Agency for Israel's own demographic tracking, placed at approximately 2006, marking the first time since the Roman period that a plurality, and by more recent figures, a clear majority when combined with total diaspora distribution patterns, of the world's Jewish population resided within the land of Israel itself, rather than dispersed across the wider diaspora that had characterized nearly the entirety of the intervening 2,000-year span. This crossing point deserves particular attention because it represents precisely the kind of specific, datable historical threshold that distinguishes a checkable claim from a vague generality. Prior to the early 21st century, for essentially the entire span since the Bar Kokhba revolt's aftermath in the 2nd century, the global Jewish population had been distributed with the plurality living somewhere in the diaspora, whether in Babylonian, later Islamic, later European, or eventually American Jewish communities. Rather than concentrated in the ancestral homeland, the animal apocalypse's regathering language describes the reversal of that 19th century pattern, occurring within living memory and documented through the ordinary demographic surveying methods. Both Israeli government statisticians and independent research organizations, including Pew, apply as a matter of routine data collection, provides as concrete and specific a fulfillment marker as an ancient text's allegorical language could reasonably be expected to produce when mapped against subsequent, independently documented history. One further demographic data point deserves inclusion here, because it addresses the specific pace of the return migration, rather than only its cumulative scale. The Jewish Agency for Israel, the organization historically responsible for coordinating and facilitating immigration to Israel, reported in its own published annual statistics that 2022 saw the highest number of immigrants arriving in Israel in over 2 decades, with more than 70,000 people making the move that year according to the agency's figures, driven substantially by an accelerated wave of immigration from Russia and Ukraine following the outbreak of the war between those two countries in February 2022. According to the agency's own contextual reporting accompanying its annual statistics release. This specific, datable acceleration, a documented surge in return migration occurring in direct, immediate response to a contemporary geopolitical crisis, illustrates that the broader pattern of regathering documented throughout this fifth sign is not a static historical achievement completed at some fixed point in the past, but a continuing, actively unfolding process that responds dynamically to global conditions even in the years immediately preceding this documentary's own production. Population projections compiled by Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, published in the Bureau's Long-Range Demographic Forecasting Reports, project that Israel's Jewish population will continue to grow substantially across coming decades, driven by a combination of continued immigration and a total fertility rate that, according to the Bureau's own published figures, remains notably higher among Israel's Jewish population than in most other economically developed nations, a demographic trajectory that, if the Bureau's own projections hold, would further extend rather than merely maintain the already documented demographic concentration this fifth sign has examined at length. A final observation closes this fifth sign appropriately. Every figure and date cited throughout comes from government census records and academic linguistic scholarship, not from any source with a theological stake in the outcome. Exactly the same evidentiary standard applied consistently across all 7 signs in this documentary. This is the fifth sign. Ancient allegorical language describing a scattering of a people across the earth, followed by a coming comprehensive regathering into a restored and expanded homeland, accompanied by a described transformation in fundamental character, mapped against the documented, statistically verifiable return migration to the land of Israel spanning from the first Aliyah in 1882 through the establishment of the modern state in 1948 and continuing through organized mass immigration waves from the Middle East, the former Soviet Union, and Ethiopia across the subsequent decades, producing, according to official Israeli demographic statistics, the largest single national concentration of Jewish population anywhere on Earth today, a demographic condition without clear precedent in the documented historical record since antiquity, accompanied by the linguistically unprecedented revival of Hebrew from purely liturgical use to full native vernacular status across an entire national population within a few generations. Like the previous 4 signs, the underlying demographic and historical data here is drawn from official government statistical agencies and published historical and linguistic scholarship, checkable against primary sources. The 6th sign returns to a theme touched on briefly during the first sign's discussion of knowledge multiplication, but Enoch treats it as a distinct, specific marker in its own right, developed most extensively across chapters 93 and 94 of the epistle, and it concerns the deliberate corruption of truth itself through false teaching produced at scale. Chapter 94, verse 5, in Isaac's translation, pronounces woe unto those who write down false words and words of error, describing them as writing them in order to lead astray, and states that when they die, no one shall remember them, a specific pairing of the crime, the deliberate production and circulation of false written material, with a specific consequence, ultimate obscurity, despite whatever temporary influence the false writing achieves. Chapter 98, verse 15, extends this with a description of woe unto you who write down lying and godless words, for they write their lies in order that men may hear them and act godlessly toward their neighbor, framing false writing not as passive error but as a deliberate mechanism specifically designed to corrupt the behavior of those who encounter it. The Book of Parables adds a further, specific dimension to this 6th sign in chapter 67, describing false teachers and leaders who will arise claiming authority they do not legitimately possess. Language multiple scholars, including Stuckenbrook, have connected to a broader Second Temple Jewish anxiety about religious and prophetic authority, becoming contested and multiplied beyond any single community's ability to adjudicate genuine claims from false ones, an anxiety that would, within a few centuries of Enoch's later sections' likely composition, become acutely relevant to the early Christian movement's own explicit concerns about false teachers and false prophets, language appearing extensively in the New Testament itself, including the Gospel of Matthew's warning in chapter 24 about false prophets arising and deceiving many, and Paul's second letter to Timothy, warning that the time will come when people will not endure sound teaching, but will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. Dr. Nicholsburg's commentary situates this 6th sign as functioning in explicit tension with the first sign's positive framing of increased knowledge, noting that the epistle presents the multiplication of writing and knowledge as morally neutral in itself, capable of producing either righteous revelation, the words of righteousness and truth described in chapter 104, or deliberate deception, the lying words described in chapters 94 and 98, with the distinguishing factor being not the volume or accessibility of the information itself, but the intent and honesty of those producing it, a distinction the text's authors clearly considered would become increasingly difficult for ordinary readers to adjudicate as the volume of both categories of writing increased simultaneously. Unlike the first 5 signs, which this documentary has presented as substantially or fully fulfilled based on documented historical and scientific evidence, the 6th sign occupies a different category, a condition scholars and the broader information environment itself indicate is actively unfolding and escalating in real time, rather than having reached a clear, completed historical threshold, and it is worth being explicit about that distinction rather than overstating the case. The scale of documented, deliberate misinformation production in the current information environment is nonetheless substantial enough to warrant serious examination against Enoch's specific language. The already cited 2018 Massachusetts Institute of Technology study published in Science, examining the spread of true and false news across Twitter over an 11-year period, found not merely that false news spread faster than true news, but that this effect appeared to be driven specifically by the novelty of false claims and the stronger emotional reactions, particularly fear, disgust, and surprise, that false stories tended to provoke compared to true ones. A finding the study's authors, Sarush Vosowi, Deb Roy, and Sinan Aral, connected directly to the underlying mechanics of how social media platforms' engagement-driven algorithms function. Mechanics that did not exist in any form prior to the 21st century and that create, structurally, an environment in which the specific behavior Enoch's authors describe, false words deliberately produced because their producers know they will be heard and will provoke a reaction, operates at a scale and speed no prior information environment in human history could support. The Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, based at the University of Oxford, has published an annual digital news report tracking public trust in news and information sources across dozens of countries since 2012. Its most recent editions have documented a sustained, multi-year decline in public trust in news media across the majority of countries surveyed, with the 2023 report finding that only 40% of respondents across all markets surveyed said they trusted most news most of the time, a figure the report's authors noted had declined from already modest levels recorded in earlier years of the survey, occurring during precisely the same period in which the raw volume of available information sources, including social media accounts, independent blogs, and now AI-generated content, has expanded beyond any single reader's or fact-checking organization's practical capacity to verify. The emergence of generative artificial intelligence capable of producing large volumes of human-like text, discussed earlier in the context of the second sign's boundary-dissolving technologies, carries a specific and directly relevant implication for this sixth sign as well, because these same systems dramatically lower the cost and effort required to produce large volumes of false or misleading written material at a scale no human writer or organization, however well-funded, could previously achieve. NewsGuard, an organization founded in 2018 specifically to rate the reliability of news and information websites using trained human journalists rather than automated systems, published a report in 2023 identifying what the organization termed AI-generated news and information websites, operating with little to no human oversight, finding, in a tracking effort the organization has continued updating since, several hundred such sites within the first year of widespread generative AI tool availability, publishing content the report characterized as frequently containing fabricated events, invented quotations attributed to real public figures, and other forms of the deliberate false writing chapters 94 and 98 describe, produced now at a volume and speed that human-authored misinformation in any prior era could not approach. The specific detail in Chapter 94 describing the ultimate obscurity awaiting those who produce false writing, that when they die, no one shall remember them, offers an interesting point of scholarly reflection when considered against the mechanics of the current information environment, because unlike earlier eras in which a deceptive author's individual reputation and legacy were closely tied to their specific, identifiable body of published work, much of the current mass production of false information operates through anonymous or algorithmically generated channels with no stable, identifiable individual author whose reputation could be remembered or forgotten in any traditional sense at all, a structural feature of the modern misinformation environment that in some respects represents an even more complete fulfillment of the ancient text's warning about ultimate anonymity and lack of enduring recognition than the original authors, writing in an era where every text had an identifiable, if sometimes pseudonymous, human author could have anticipated. There is a further specific detail in this sixth sign that merits close attention, because Enoch does not describe false teaching as arising from outside the community of belief, some external, easily identified adversary. Chapter 94, read in context with the surrounding chapters, addresses these warnings specifically to those the text considers sinners arising from within the broader community the author is writing to. False teachers whose deception is dangerous precisely because it comes cloaked in the language and authority structures the community already trusts, not from an obviously foreign or hostile source easily dismissed at first encounter. This internal, trust-exploiting character of the deception Enoch warns against has a specific and well-documented modern parallel in the phenomenon researchers term impersonation and authority, spoofing within digital misinformation, false content that succeeds specifically because it mimics or directly appropriates the visual and stylistic markers of legitimate, trusted institutions. A 2022 report published by the Stanford Internet Observatory, a research center within Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center that studies the abuse of information technologies, documented extensive networks of what the report termed pink slime journalism, websites deliberately designed to visually and structurally resemble legitimate local news outlets, complete with generic-sounding names evoking real local newspapers, while actually publishing content, in many documented cases produced with minimal or no original local reporting, that the report found frequently advanced specific political or commercial interests without disclosure. The report identified over 1,000 such sites operating across the United States alone, a finding subsequently corroborated and expanded by NewsGuard's own independent tracking efforts. The specific mechanism these operations exploit, the pre-existing trust readers extend to what appears to be a legitimate local news institution, mirrors with striking structural precision the pattern Enoch's authors describe. Deception that succeeds not through obvious, easily dismissed falsehood, but through careful appropriation of the markers of legitimate authority the audience has already learned to trust. Dr. Stuckenbrook's commentary notes that this specific concern, corruption arising from within trusted structures rather than from clearly external threats, recurs throughout Second Temple period literature more broadly, reflecting genuine historical anxieties about competing claims to religious and communal authority during a period of significant internal Jewish sectarian division, the same broader historical context that produced the distinct communities responsible for preserving texts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. Communities that in some cases explicitly considered rival Jewish groups, not only external Gentile powers, as sources of dangerous religious corruption. The scale of this internal, authority-mimicking deception in the current environment extends well beyond text-based news sites into the visual and audio domains through the same synthetic media technology discussed earlier in the Second Sign's treatment of deepfakes. A particularly relevant documented case involved a March 2023 incident, extensively reported by outlets, including the Associated Press, and subsequently analyzed in academic literature on AI-generated disinformation, in which an AI-generated image falsely depicting the Pope wearing an elaborate white puffer jacket circulated widely across social media platforms before being identified as synthetic, a relatively low-stakes example that nonetheless demonstrated, according to the subsequent academic analysis published in outlets including the Columbia Journalism Review, how quickly and widely synthetic content depicting a figure of significant religious authority could spread and be initially accepted as genuine by a substantial portion of viewers, even absent any sophisticated technical deception beyond the base capability of publicly available AI image generation tools at that time. More consequential documented instances involve synthetic audio and video specifically designed to impersonate political and civic authority figures. The Federal Communications Commission, the United States government agency responsible for regulating interstate communications, issued a formal declaratory ruling in February 2024, making AI-generated voice cloning used in robocalls illegal under existing telephone consumer protection law, a regulatory action taken directly in response to a documented January 2024 incident in which an AI-generated robocall impersonating the voice of President Joe Biden was sent to New Hampshire voters ahead of that state's presidential primary election, urging recipients not to vote, an incident the New Hampshire Attorney General's office subsequently investigated and, according to its own published statement, traced to a Texas-based political consultant who was later indicted on criminal charges related to voter suppression and unauthorized impersonation of a candidate, according to court filings. Reported by the Associated Press in 2024. This specific case represents, in a form the ancient text's authors could not have anticipated in its technical mechanism, but described with notable precision in its underlying structure, exactly the pattern chapters 94 and 98 warn against. False words deliberately produced and disseminated specifically because the producer calculated that the audience would hear them, act on them, and be led toward behavior. in this documented instance not voting that the deceiver specifically intended, wrapped in the appropriated authority and trusted voice of a legitimate figure the audience already believed they could rely on. One further scholarly point deserves inclusion before closing out this sixth sign, because it addresses directly why this particular marker is treated with more caution in this documentary than the previous 5, rather than simply asserted as complete. Dr. Nicholsberg's commentary is explicit that the epistle's warnings about false teaching function, within the text's own internal logic, as an ongoing moral exhortation addressed to every generation of readers, not a single, datable historical event with a clear beginning and end, the way the destruction of the Second Temple or the Babylonian exile represent discrete, completed historical occurrences. The text's own genre, as wisdom and warning literature rather than narrative history, resists the kind of clean before and after fulfillment marker the fifth sign's demographic data, for instance, can more straightforwardly provide. This genre distinction matters for honest evaluation. What can be said with confidence, based on the documented evidence already presented, spanning the MIT study on differential spread rates between true and false information, the Reuters Institute's multi-year trust decline data, the Stanford Internet Observatory's pink slime journalism findings, and the FCC's own regulatory response to documented AI voice cloning used in a criminal voter suppression case, is that the specific structural conditions Enoch's authors describe, false words produced deliberately because their producers calculate they will be heard and will corrupt behavior, operating specifically through appropriated trust and authority rather than obvious external deception, are not merely present in the current information environment, but are measurably and, according to nearly every cited source's own trend data, accelerating rather than stabilizing or declining. Whether that trajectory represents the specific, complete fulfillment the ancient text anticipates, or an ongoing condition without a clear terminal threshold, is a judgment this documentary leaves appropriately open, consistent with the genuine uncertainty the relevant Enoch scholarship itself expresses about how this particular sign's fulfillment should be assessed. One further, more recent development deserves inclusion here, because it represents the most direct possible convergence of the false teaching problem this sixth sign describes, with the specific technological acceleration already documented across the first and second signs. In May 2024, OpenAI, the organization responsible for developing some of the most widely used generative artificial intelligence systems, published its own threat intelligence report, documenting and disrupting 5 separate covert influence operations that the company's own investigators found had been using its AI tools to generate large volumes of political and social commentary content, including fake social media engagement and fabricated commentary designed to appear as authentic grassroots opinion, according to the report's own published findings. The operations, according to OpenAI's public disclosure, originated from state-linked actors in Russia, China, Iran, and Israel, along with a private company operating out of Israel, demonstrating that the specific mechanism of false, deliberately deceptive content production Enoch's chapters 94 and 98 describe has now been documented by the very organization building the underlying technology as an active, ongoing, multinational pattern rather than a hypothetical future risk. This is the sixth sign, and it is presented here with appropriate caution as the one marker among the 7 that scholars and the documented data itself indicate remains an actively unfolding condition, rather than a fully completed historical threshold. Ancient warning language about the deliberate production of false writing intended to deceive and corrupt behavior at scale, arising specifically from within trusted structures rather than clearly external sources, contrasted directly against the same text's more positive framing of legitimate knowledge multiplication covered in the first sign, mapped against a documented, measurable, and by every available metric, still escalating modern information environment characterized by algorithmically amplified false content outpacing true content in reach and speed, over 1,000 documented pink slime news sites, appropriating the trusted appearance of legitimate local journalism, a sustained multi-year documented decline in public trust in information sources across dozens of countries, and the recent legally and criminally documented emergence of AI-generated voice cloning used to impersonate specific named public officials for the explicit purpose of altering recipients' behavior. Unlike the first 5 signs, this one is presented as in progress rather than complete, a condition the data indicates is actively worsening rather than a threshold already crossed and stabilized. Dr. Allison's research draws a further, specific connection worth including here Between this insistence on unpredictability and a parallel passage in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, generally dated by New Testament scholars to the early 50s of the Common Era, making it among the earliest surviving Christian documents, predating even the Gospels themselves in most scholarly chronologies. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 3 of that letter state that concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, using the identical thief in the night comparison found in Matthew's Gospel and, by extension, in the broader apocalyptic tradition Enoch's authors had already established centuries earlier. Dr. Allison's published analysis argues that the consistent, cross-textual repetition of this specific image across independently authored New Testament documents, written by different authors in different decades to different audiences, indicates that the thief in the night comparison had become, by the middle of the first century of the Common Era, an established, widely recognized formula within the broader Jewish and early Christian apocalyptic tradition, a formula whose ultimate literary root, according to the textual genealogy Dr. Stuckenbrook and other Enoch specialists have traced, extends back to the Enochic material this documentary has examined throughout. This is the seventh sign, the final one, and it is different from all six that came before it in a way that matters more than any single detail already covered. Where the first six signs describe conditions, states of the world that develop, accumulate, and can in principle be checked against a historical or scientific record, the seventh sign describes a single, specific, climactic event, and the text is explicit that this event has not yet occurred, that it remains, from the perspective of every generation of readers across the entire 2,000 plus years since the text's composition, still to come. Chapter 46 of the Book of Parables describes a vision in which Enoch sees one who had a head of days, ancient in appearance and full of years, and beside him another figure whose face had the appearance of a man, subsequently identified across the following chapters as the Son of Man, a figure the text describes in extraordinary terms. Chapter 48, verse 3, states that this figure was named before the sun, and the constellations were created, before the stars of heaven were made, language indicating a pre-existence prior to the creation of the physical universe itself. Chapter 48, verse 6, adds that he was chosen and hidden in the presence of the Lord of Spirits before the world was created, and will remain before him for eternity. Chapter 62 describes the specific moment of this figure's revelation, stating that the kings and the mighty and all who possess the earth will bless and glorify and extol him who rules over all, who was hidden, for from the beginning the Son of Man was hidden, and the Most High preserved him in the presence of his might, and revealed him to the chosen, a passage explicitly framing the revelation of this figure as a specific, datable future event from the perspective of the text's original composition, not an ongoing or already accomplished condition, the way the first six signs are framed. Chapter 69, in its closing verses, describes the specific consequence of this revelation, stating that the sum of judgment was given unto the Son of Man, and he caused the sinners to pass away and be destroyed from off the face of the earth. And those who have led the world astray shall be bound in chains, and their ruinous congregation shall be imprisoned, describing a comprehensive final judgment accompanying this figure's revelation. Chapter 90. In the closing sections of the dream visions, extending beyond the regathering material already covered as the fifth sign, describes a further, final stage, the establishment of what the text calls a new house, greater and loftier than the first, and the transformation of the assembled sheep, with a final figure described as white, whom the sheep fear and obey, presiding over this final, completed state. Language, multiple scholars including Nicholsburg and Tiller read as pointing toward the same climactic figure and event described in the parables, even though the dream visions and the parables represent separately authored sections of the composite text. The sealed book imagery, referenced in this documentary's earlier sections and worth addressing directly here as part of the seventh sign, appears explicitly in chapter 104 in a passage addressed directly to what the text calls the righteous, stating that they should not be afraid because their names are written before the glory of the Great One, and that a book will be given to them, sealed until a specific time, at which point its contents will be opened and made known. The Book of Revelation, the final book of the Christian New Testament, generally dated by New Testament scholars to the final decade of the first century of the Common Era, contains imagery scholars including Dr. David Onay in his 3-volume Word Biblical Commentary on Revelation, published between 1997 and 998, and Dr. G.K. Beale, in his 1999 New International Greek Testament commentary on the same book, have extensively documented as drawing on and paralleling Enochic apocalyptic literature, most directly in Revelation chapter 5's vision of a sealed scroll that no one in heaven or on earth is found worthy to open, until the figure described as a lamb who was slain proves worthy to break the seals, a passage bearing striking structural resemblance to Enoch's sealed book imagery, followed across the subsequent chapters of Revelation by a sequence of judgments unsealed progressively as the scroll is opened. This convergence between Enochic and Johannine apocalyptic imagery has drawn sustained scholarly attention, with Dr. Lauren Stuckenbrook specifically noting in published work on the reception history of Enoch within early Christianity that the author of Revelation, along with the author of the New Testament Epistle of Jude, which directly quotes Enoch by name in verses 14 and 15, attributing a specific prophecy about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment, demonstrates that at least some segments of the earliest Christian movement treated Enochic material not merely as interesting background literature but as source material carrying genuine authoritative weight that would later be formally rejected by the 4th century councils. This documentary opened by discussing, but that clearly informed the imagery and theological vocabulary of texts that did ultimately secure canonical status. What distinguishes this 7th sign from the previous 6, and what requires this documentary to treat it with a fundamentally different evidentiary approach, is that unlike knowledge acceleration, forbidden technological boundary crossing, total warfare, environmental disruption, demographic regathering, or the spread of deliberate misinformation, all conditions that develop gradually and leave a continuous, checkable historical and scientific record as they unfold, the 7th sign describes a singular, discrete event, the specific, public revelation of a specific figure accompanied by a specific, comprehensive act of final judgment, a category of event that by its very nature either has happened in some clearly documented, verifiable, public sense the entire world could in principle observe and confirm, or it has not. By that standard, every scholar cited throughout this documentary, working across every relevant academic discipline, from Enochic textual criticism to New Testament studies to systematic theology across every major Christian tradition, is in agreement on a single point. This event has not yet occurred. There is no documented, verifiable, publicly observable instance in the historical record, checkable through the same kind of primary source, peer-reviewed, institutionally verified methodology this documentary has applied to each of the preceding 6 signs, of the specific figure Enoch describes being publicly revealed, of the comprehensive final judgment chapter 69 describes as accompanying that revelation, or of the sealed book described in chapter 104 being opened in the specific, final sense the text anticipates. This is not a claim this documentary is making cautiously or with reservation, the way the 6th sign's ongoing, harder to fully verify condition was presented earlier. This is a straightforward statement of documented historical fact agreed upon across every relevant tradition and academic discipline that has engaged with this material, Christian and secular, believing and skeptical alike. The 7th sign, by its own text's explicit framing as a specific, climactic, publicly observable event rather than a gradually developing condition, remains, as of the date of this documentary's production, unfulfilled. What Enoch's text does provide, and what the surrounding scholarship has extensively examined, is a description of the conditions that precede this 7th sign, precisely the 6 signs already covered in this documentary. Chapter 93, in the section of the epistle scholars termed the Apocalypse of Weeks, provides Enoch's own internal chronological framework, dividing history into a sequence of 10 weeks, with the text's own narrative voice, writing from within what it presents as the 7th week, describing a period in which, in verse 10 of the standard chapter numbering, the elect will be chosen as witnesses of righteousness, receiving 7-fold instruction concerning the whole of creation. Language Dr. Vanderkam's extensive published work on the Apocalypse of Weeks connects to a period of expanding knowledge and understanding, immediately preceding the final, climactic 8th, 9th, and 10th weeks, in which the text describes judgment being executed, a new house being built for the elect, corresponding to the imagery already discussed in the 5th sign. And finally, in the 10th week, the great, eternal judgment corresponding to the 7th sign's still unfulfilled climactic event. Dr. Vanderkam's analysis of this schema, developed across multiple published studies, including his contribution to the Nickelsburg Hermeneia commentary, argues that Enoch's own internal chronology places the composition's contemporary readers, and by direct extension, based on the specific conditions the text associates with the seventh week, readers in the modern era, characterized by the knowledge expansion, this documentary's first sign extensively documented within that seventh week itself, the period immediately preceding the text's final, climactic sequence of judgment weeks. If Vanderkam's chronological reading is correct, and it represents, by his own account and by the citations his work has received across subsequent Enoch scholarship, a mainstream rather than fringe position within the field, then the 6 signs this documentary has already covered are not merely interesting historical parallels considered in isolation. They are, within the text's own internal logic, the specific markers Enoch's authors associated with the period immediately preceding the 7th sign's still unfulfilled climactic event. There is a further textual detail worth examining closely here, because it bears directly on why Enoch scholars, along with New Testament scholars working on the Gospels and Pauline epistles, describe the character of this 7th sign in terms that emphasize its unpredictability, a specific quality that distinguishes it from the 6 preceding signs, even within the text's own internal presentation. Chapter 1, 100 verses 4 and 5, part of the same epistle material that produced the 6 signs' warnings about false teaching, describes angels descending into secret places on a single day, gathering together all who have brought sin to consummation, with the text emphasizing the suddenness and comprehensiveness of this event, rather than providing the kind of gradual, developing timeline the preceding 6 signs describe. This emphasis on suddenness rather than gradual accumulation appears consistently across the relevant apocalyptic material, both within Enoch and in the later Christian texts scholars have connected to it. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verses 36 through 44. In a passage widely recognized by New Testament scholars including Dr. Dale Allison of Princeton Theological Seminary in his extensive published work on the synoptic apocalyptic discourse, as drawing on the same broader Second Temple apocalyptic tradition that produced Enoch's parables material, explicitly states that no one knows the day or the hour, comparing the event's suddenness to the unexpected arrival of a thief in the night, and to the situation of Noah's contemporaries who, the text states, were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the flood came and swept them all away, with no advance warning perceptible to those living through the ordinary course of their daily lives immediately prior. This specific detail, that the 7th sign's climactic event is characterized by fundamental unpredictability in its exact timing, even while the preceding conditions accumulate and become identifiable, distinguishes Enoch's framework, and the closely related New Testament apocalyptic material scholars have connected to it, from more deterministic, ancient, prophetic, and astrological traditions that claim the ability to calculate specific future dates with precision. Enoch's own astronomical book, discussed extensively in the first sign's coverage of the text's calendrical sophistication, demonstrates that the text's authors were entirely capable of precise, technical, mathematically rigorous calculation when the subject matter called for it. The solar and lunar calendar mechanics laid out across chapters 72 through 82 represent genuine mathematical sophistication for their era, according to Dr. Vanderkam's technical analysis of the underlying schema. That the same broader textual tradition explicitly declines to apply that same calculational precision to the timing of the 7th sign specifically. Insisting instead on fundamental unpredictability is a deliberate authorial choice rather than an oversight, one multiple scholars, including Dr. Allison read as a genre marker distinguishing genuine apocalyptic warning literature, concerned with moral exhortation and readiness, rather than predictive calculation, from the various astrological and numerological date-setting traditions that proliferated across the ancient Mediterranean world and that both Enoch's authors and the later New Testament writers appear to have deliberately positioned their own material against. This distinction carries a direct, practical implication for how this documentary presents its overall findings, and it is worth stating explicitly rather than leaving implicit. The 6 signs already covered in this documentary describe conditions, verifiable, checkable, historically documented conditions that either exist or do not, and this documentary has presented substantial evidence, drawn from peer-reviewed scholarship and official government and scientific institutional data, that 5 of those 6 conditions are substantially or fully met in the current historical moment, with the 6th actively developing, but the text's own explicit and repeated insistence on the fundamental unpredictability of the 7th sign's specific timing means that the accumulation of the preceding 6 conditions, however extensively documented, cannot, according to the plain reading of the text's own internal logic, and the closely related New Testament material scholars have connected to it, be used to calculate or predict a specific date for the seventh sign's fulfillment. The text explicitly warns against exactly that kind of calculation, even while providing, in remarkable and checkable detail, a description of the conditions that precede it. Dr. Nicolsburg's Hermeneia commentary addresses this tension directly, noting that the Epistle of Enoch functions simultaneously as descriptive, providing genuine markers by which the faithful reader can recognize the approach of the final period, and as explicitly non-predictive regarding exact timing, a combination that requires careful, disciplined reading rather than either dismissing the described conditions as mere coincidence or overreaching into specific date calculation. The text itself explicitly warns against. This documentary has attempted throughout to maintain that same discipline, presenting extensively documented evidence for the fulfillment of 6 specific, checkable conditions, while being equally clear and explicit that the seventh and final sign, the actual, publicly observable revelation of the Son of Man and the accompanying final judgment, remains, as of this documentary's production, an event that has not occurred, and one whose specific future timing the source text itself explicitly and repeatedly declines to specify. This is the seventh sign. Ancient text describing a pre-existent figure called the Son of Man, hidden since before the creation of the physical universe, whose future public revelation will be accompanied by a comprehensive final judgment and the opening of a sealed book containing the names of the righteous, imagery that measurably shaped the composition of the New Testament's own Book of Revelation according to extensive published scholarship on the two texts' literary relationship, and whose specific timing the text itself, alongside the closely related gospel material scholars have connected to it, explicitly and repeatedly frames as fundamentally unpredictable even while its preceding conditions accumulate and become identifiable. Unlike the 6 signs already covered, each supported by extensive, documented, historical, demographic, and scientific evidence indicating substantial or complete fulfillment, this seventh sign remains, by the unanimous agreement of every relevant scholarly tradition, and by the most basic, straightforward reading of the historical record available to any observer, an event that has not yet taken place. Enoch's own internal chronological framework, developed extensively in Dr. Vanderkam's published scholarship on the Apocalypse of Weeks, places contemporary readers on the strength of the same knowledge acceleration conditions this documentary's first sign already established as fulfilled. Within the specific period, the text itself identifies as immediately preceding this final, still awaited event, an event the text is explicit. No reader, in any generation, can calculate the exact timing of in advance. 7 signs, drawn from 5 separately authored sections of a single composite text written across centuries by different hands, preserved through a manuscript chain spanning over 2,000 years, surviving a 4th century council's attempt at erasure, surviving a millennium and a half of exclusion from the Western Christian canon, surviving specifically because a church in the Ethiopian highlands refused to let the text disappear, and then corroborated, independently and separately, by 11 separate copies found sealed in caves above the Dead Sea, hidden by a community that had no way of knowing anyone would ever need to verify their choice of which texts mattered enough to preserve. Let's hold all 7 together, in sequence, because the pattern only becomes fully visible when you see them side by side, laid out in order, rather than as isolated claims examined one at a time in complete separation from one another. The first sign, the multiplication of knowledge and the opening of the heavens to human sight, chapters 80 and 104, documented against a data volume increase measured in the tens of zettabytes annually, a doubling of scientific publication roughly every 9 years sustained since the mid-20th century, the transition of astronomical observation from a privilege of the few to a matter of daily public access through instruments including Hubble and the James Webb Space Telescope, and mobile technology placing access to more recorded knowledge than the entire Library of Alexandria in the hands of over 4 billion people worldwide. Fulfilled. The second sign, the corruption of fixed boundaries through forbidden knowledge, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 15, documented against the first confirmed case of heritable human genome editing in 2018. The near-universal international scientific condemnation that followed specifically because that modification would propagate to future generations, the erosion of the human-machine distinction through artificial intelligence systems, whose own creators have publicly warned may present risks comparable to pandemics and nuclear war, and synthetic media technology dissolving the boundary between authentic and fabricated human appearance and speech. Fulfilled, the third sign, warfare of a scale and character exceeding anything conventional armies had previously produced. Chapters 99 and 100 documented against the emergence of nuclear weapons technology within a compressed 7-year span from theoretical discovery to operational deployment, a global arsenal that peaked at over 70,000 warheads. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists' sustained assessment of 90 seconds to midnight, representing the closest to catastrophe the organization has recorded across its entire 77-year publication history, and repeated, extensively documented instances of violence, specifically dissolving family and kinship bonds across multiple 20th and 21st century conflicts. Fulfilled, the fourth sign, the earth itself registering and crying out against harm done to it. Chapters 7, 9, 84, and 100, documented against a scientific consensus built from over a century of direct instrumental measurement, showing the 10 warmest years in the entire recorded temperature history, all occurring within the most recent decade, Arctic sea ice declining at over 12% per decade, the Greenland ice sheet's mass loss rate increasing 7-fold between the 1990s and 2010s, ocean acidity increasing by roughly 30% since the industrial era began, and an intergovernmental science policy platform assessment finding around 1 million species, now threatened with extinction, more than at any point in human history. Fulfilled, the fifth sign, the scattering and comprehensive regathering of a specific people, chapters 89 and 90, documented against a return migration to the land of Israel spanning from 1,882 through 1,948, and continuing across subsequent decades of organized mass immigration, producing, according to official Israeli government demographic statistics, the largest single national concentration of Jewish population anywhere on Earth today, a demographic condition without precedent since antiquity, accompanied by the linguistically unprecedented revival of Hebrew from purely liturgical use to full native vernacular status within a few generations, fulfilled, with the appropriate scholarly caution that the ancient author's own anticipated mechanism and timeline differ from the actual historical process documented. The sixth sign, the deliberate production of false teaching at a scale intended to corrupt behavior, chapters 94 and 98, documented against a measurably widening gap between the spread rates of false and true information online, a sustained multi-year decline in public trust in information sources across dozens of countries, over 1,000 documented websites deliberately appropriating the appearance of legitimate local journalism, and the first confirmed criminal case of AI-generated voice cloning used to impersonate a specific named public official for the explicit purpose of altering voter behavior. In progress, actively escalating according to every metric examined, not yet a completed historical threshold the way the first 5 signs represent. And the seventh sign, the public revelation of a pre-existent figure called the Son of Man, hidden since before the foundation of the physical universe, accompanied by a comprehensive final judgment and the opening of a sealed book. Not fulfilled? Explicitly, unambiguously, by the unanimous agreement of every scholar this documentary has cited, across every tradition, believing and skeptical alike. An event, the text itself, in language echoed almost exactly by the Gospel of Matthew's warning about the days of Noah, insists cannot be calculated in advance by any reader in any generation, however completely the preceding conditions accumulate around them. Read that recap once more, slowly, and notice what it actually is. Not a single vague warning repeated 7 times in different clothing, but 7 genuinely distinct claims drawn from 5 separately authored sections of text, addressing 7 entirely different domains of human experience: information, biology, warfare, ecology, demography, communication, and finally, theology itself. 6 of those 7 domains now have a documented, dated, checkable answer sitting inside the historical and scientific record. An answer this documentary did not have to manufacture or stretch to find, because the relevant scientific bodies, government statistical agencies, and academic institutions had already, independently, and for entirely secular reasons of their own, produced and published exactly the data required to check each claim against reality. 6 conditions, documented, dated, verified against the published, peer-reviewed, institutionally maintained record of the world's leading scientific bodies, government statistical agencies, and academic scholarship. And one event, the specific event, the 6 conditions are described, within the text's own internal logic, as laid out extensively in Dr. Vanderkam's work on the Apocalypse of Weeks, as preceding that has not yet occurred. What should be made of that specific configuration, 6 fulfilled or actively fulfilling, 1 still awaited, is a question this documentary has deliberately avoided answering with false certainty because the text itself, read carefully and in its full scholarly context rather than through the lens of sensationalized popular treatment, does not permit that kind of certainty. Enoch's authors were remarkably precise about conditions, and remarkably, deliberately, insistently vague about final timing. That combination, precision about the signs and insistence on unpredictability about the culmination, is not a contradiction in the text. It is, according to Dr. Allison's extensive published work on the closely related synoptic apocalyptic material, the entire point of the genre, literature designed to produce sustained readiness and moral seriousness across every generation of readers who encounter it, rather than a specific calculation any single generation could complete and then set aside as resolved. There is a further dimension to this configuration worth sitting with before closing, because it concerns not the content of the 7 signs individually, but the manuscript history that preserved them across 2,000 years, a history this documentary opened with and now returns to for its final word. Consider what had to happen, across more than 2,000 years, for these 7 specific claims, assembled from 5 separately authored texts, to survive intact into the present moment in a form precise enough to be checked, sign by sign, against a modern historical and scientific record the original authors could not have imagined in any of its specific technical details. Details spanning satellite telemetry, genomic sequencing, and global temperature datasets, none of them could have possessed even the conceptual vocabulary to describe. The Book of the Watchers, composed likely in the 3rd century before the Common Era, had to survive Ptolemaic and Seleucid political upheaval across the eastern Mediterranean. The Book of Parables, composed later, likely in the 1st century before the Common Era, had to survive the Roman conquest of Judea, the 2 Jewish revolts against Rome in 66 to 73 and 132 to 135 of the Common Era, and the resulting destruction of the Second Temple and displacement of the Judean Jewish population that followed. The full composite text had to survive the Council of Laodicea's exclusion in 364, a decision made by a body of bishops, most of whom, based on the Council's own surviving canon list, were more concerned with establishing doctrinal uniformity across a rapidly Christianizing Roman Empire than with any specific theological objection to Enoch's content, an exclusion that nonetheless proved durable across the following 16 centuries within the Western and Eastern churches that adopted it. Meanwhile, and entirely independently, the Ethiopian Church, operating outside the political and ecclesiastical structures that produced that exclusion, continued a parallel, unbroken chain of manuscript transmission, monks in the highlands around Axum recopying the text by hand across generation after generation, a preservation effort that had no way of anticipating that its work would eventually be cross-checked against Aramaic fragments recovered from caves above the Dead Sea, fragments hidden by yet another community, the Qumran sect, operating in yet another completely separate context, with its own reasons for preserving the text that had nothing to do with anticipating a future need for manuscript verification across disconnected traditions, separated by geography, language, and centuries of no direct contact. Dr. Michael Knibb's 1978 Oxford Critical Edition, comparing the Ethiopic manuscripts directly against the Qumran Aramaic fragments where overlapping material exists, found, according to his own published textual notes, substantial consistency between the 2 independently transmitted traditions on the core content of the shared passages, variation in specific wording and grammatical detail of the kind textual critics expect across any manuscript tradition, spanning centuries of hand copying, but fundamental agreement on the substance of what the text actually says, including the specific content underlying each of the 7 signs this documentary has examined. That degree of independent corroboration, 2 textual traditions separated by geography, language, religious context, and centuries of no documented contact, converging on substantially the same content, is the kind of evidence textual critics and manuscript scholars treat as carrying genuine evidentiary weight regarding a text's stability and authenticity, independent of any question about the text's ultimate theological status or claims. Whatever conclusion any individual viewer draws about the specific claims examined throughout this documentary, the underlying manuscript reliability, the fact that what we are reading today in Knibb's, Isaac's, Nicholsberg's, and Vanderkam's careful scholarly translations substantially represents what ancient communities across widely separated contexts believed the text actually said, is itself well established by the ordinary standards of textual and manuscript scholarship applied to any ancient document. There is one final detail worth including before this documentary closes. A detail drawn from the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's own contemporary statements about the text it has preserved for over a millennium and a half. Abune Matthias I, the current patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, addressing the church's relationship to Enoch in public remarks reported by Ethiopian religious media in September 2023, affirmed the text's continued canonical status within the Ethiopian tradition and its ongoing relevance to the church's teaching about the end times, describing the book as a treasure the church has been entrusted to safeguard on behalf of the wider Christian world, language that frames the entire preservation effort. This documentary has traced across 2,000 years, not as an accident of history, but as a specific, sustained act of institutional custodianship undertaken by a single church tradition across 16 centuries of otherwise near universal Christian exclusion of the text. What remains, after walking through all 7 signs with the full weight of the manuscript evidence, the peer-reviewed scholarship, and the documented historical and scientific record laid alongside each one, is a text that describes 6 specific conditions now substantially or actively fulfilled, verified not through speculation or motivated reasoning, but through the published, checkable work of researchers at Stanford, at Notre Dame, at Oxford, at King's College London, at NASA, at NOAA, at the IPCC, and at dozens of other institutions with no theological stake whatsoever in whether an ancient apocalyptic text turns out to describe the modern world with unsettling precision. Alongside a 7th condition, the specific climactic event, those 6 conditions, are described as preceding, that remains, by the unanimous testimony of every relevant tradition and by the plain evidence, available to any observer. Still ahead, the text itself, across every section examined in this documentary, from the Book of the Watcher's warning about corrupted knowledge, to the epistle's insistence on readiness rather than calculation, to the parable's description of a hidden figure whose revelation cannot be dated in advance, converges on a single, consistent instruction to its reader, an instruction that has nothing to do with predicting a specific date and everything to do with how one chooses to live in the period the text describes as preceding that still awaited event. Chapter 104. The same chapter that opened this documentary's first sign with its description of hidden knowledge being revealed, closes its own argument, not with a calculation but with an exhortation, addressed to the righteous, telling them to be hopeful, and not to abandon the hope they once had, because they shall know that God searches out their inmost thoughts, and that their names are written before the glory of the Great One. It's worth pausing here to address directly a question any careful viewer should be asking by this point in the documentary, because raising it and engaging with it honestly matters more than simply presenting an unbroken chain of confirming evidence. The question is straightforward. Is this pattern, 6 ancient conditions, mapping onto 6 modern developments, genuinely significant? Or is it the product of what psychologists and researchers of cognitive bias term confirmation bias, the well-documented human tendency to notice and remember information that confirms an expected pattern while overlooking or discounting information that would complicate or contradict it? This is a legitimate scholarly concern, and it deserves a direct answer rather than dismissal. Dr. Nickelsburg's and Dr. Vanderkam's Hermeneia commentary, the most comprehensive academic treatment of the text available in English, does not itself argue for the specific modern correlations this documentary has presented. Their scholarly project is philological and historical, establishing what the text meant to its original ancient audience and how it developed across its composite textual history, not tracing forward its potential application to 21st century conditions. The specific modern correlations drawn throughout this documentary, the mapping of Chapter 80's knowledge acceleration language onto data volume statistics, or Chapter 100's family dissolving violence onto documented nuclear arsenal figures, represent this documentary's own analytical work, applying the historically and philologically established meaning of the ancient text, as that meaning has been carefully reconstructed by the scholars cited throughout, to a body of independently documented modern historical and scientific data. That distinction matters, and stating it plainly is part of intellectual honesty about what this documentary has and has not established. What has been established, through extensive citation of primary, checkable sources, is that the ancient text says what this documentary has represented it as saying, verified against Nibs, Isaacs, and the Qumran fragment-based scholarly consensus on the text's actual content, and that the modern data cited, spanning NASA's temperature records, NOAA's ocean heat content measurements, Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics demographic figures, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists' Doomsday Clock assessments, and the dozens of other primary sources referenced throughout, accurately represents what those institutions have themselves published and verified. What remains a matter of interpretation, appropriately left to each individual viewer's own judgment rather than asserted with false certainty by this documentary, is whether the correspondence between these two independently verified bodies of information, the ancient text's content and the modern historical record, constitutes meaningful fulfillment of prophecy in a theological sense. Coincidental pattern matching of the kind confirmation bias research warns against, or something in between, that resists easy categorization in either direction. What can be said with confidence, independent of how any individual viewer resolves that interpretive question, is that the specific conditions Enoch's ancient authors described, writing across a span of centuries, with no possible awareness of each other's specific contributions to what would eventually become a single composite text, do in fact correspond, in detail specific enough to be checked and verified rather than dismissed as vague generality, to conditions that are genuinely, independently, and separately documented as characterizing the historical period in which this documentary was produced. That correspondence exists. It is checkable. Every source cited throughout this documentary is a real, published, institutionally maintained record that any viewer can independently verify. What that correspondence ultimately means is a question this documentary has deliberately left to its viewers, consistent with the text's own repeated insistence that readiness and reflection, not calculation and certainty, are the appropriate response to the conditions it describes. There is a further scholarly framework worth introducing here, because it offers a useful lens through which to hold the specific configuration this documentary has presented: 6 signs substantially fulfilled or actively developing, 1 sign explicitly not yet fulfilled. New Testament scholars working on eschatology, the theological study of last things, have long used the phrase already but not yet to describe a structural feature they find throughout early Christian apocalyptic literature. The idea that certain aspects of a final, climactic divine intervention are understood as having already begun or already been set in motion, while the complete, final consummation of that intervention remains genuinely future. Dr. George Eldon Ladd, whose 1974 study, A Theology of the New Testament, published by Eerdmans, remains a standard reference work on this framework within New Testament scholarship, argued extensively that this already but not yet tension is not a contradiction or a later theological patch applied to reconcile awkward delay, but a deliberate, coherent structural feature present from the earliest layers of the relevant apocalyptic and early Christian literature itself. Enoch's own 7-sign structure, as this documentary has presented it, maps with notable precision onto exactly this already but not yet framework. 6 conditions the text describes as belonging to the period immediately preceding the final event, already substantially or actively present, and the final, climactic event itself, the revelation of the Son of Man and the accompanying judgment, genuinely, explicitly, not yet. Rather than representing an awkward or embarrassing gap in the prophecy's fulfillment, this specific configuration is, according to the already but not yet framework scholars have identified across the broader corpus of ancient Jewish and early Christian apocalyptic literature, precisely the structure this entire genre of literature is designed to produce: a description of the conditions, marking a period of heightened significance and moral seriousness, paired with an explicit, deliberate refusal to specify the exact timing of that period's culmination. Dr. Stuckenbrock's own published work extends this observation specifically to Enoch, arguing that the text's function within its original Second Temple Jewish context and its subsequent reception within early Christian communities, including the authors of Jude and Revelation, was never primarily to provide readers with a predictive timeline they could use to calculate a specific date, a use of the text Stuckenbrock's scholarship explicitly and repeatedly cautions against as a misreading of the genre, but rather to provide a framework for recognizing the moral and historical significance of the period one finds oneself living within, and responding to that recognition with the specific ethical seriousness described throughout the epistle's exhortations to righteousness the text consistently calls for. This documentary has attempted, throughout, to honor that scholarly caution, presenting the 6 substantially or actively fulfilled signs as genuinely significant, checkable, documented correspondences between an ancient text and the modern historical record, while being equally clear and repeated in stating that the seventh and final sign remains unfulfilled and that the text itself, in language corroborated by the closely related gospel material examined in the seventh sign's own coverage, explicitly and repeatedly warns against attempting to calculate its specific timing. What then should a careful, thoughtful viewer take from this material? Having sat through the full weight of the manuscript history, the scholarly citations, and the 6 independently documented bodies of modern historical and scientific evidence this documentary has laid alongside the ancient text's own language. Not this documentary would suggest a specific date to mark on a calendar, since the text itself explicitly precludes that kind of calculation, and every scholar cited throughout has been consistent in warning against it. Not, either, a dismissal of the entire pattern as mere coincidence, given the specificity and checkability of the correspondences documented throughout, each one drawn from primary, institutionally verified sources, rather than impressionistic or vague generality. What the text itself, read across all 5 of its composite sections and considered in light of the extensive scholarly work this documentary has drawn on throughout, seems to call for instead is a kind of sustained attentiveness. The specific quality Chapter 104's closing exhortation to hope and Chapter 93's Apocalypse of Weeks both point toward a recognition that the period one finds oneself living within carries genuine significance, whatever ultimate theological framework an individual viewer brings to interpreting that significance, without requiring or permitting the kind of false certainty about specific timing the text itself, in its most explicit and repeated instruction, warns its readers away from. Before closing entirely, it's worth returning to the figure whose name this entire text bears, because the biblical Enoch himself occupies an unusual position within the wider scriptural tradition, one that adds a further layer of context to why this specific body of literature attracted the intense scribal attention across so many centuries that produced the manuscript record this documentary has traced. The canonical Hebrew Bible mentions Enoch directly in only a handful of verses. Genesis chapter 5, verses 18 through 24, within the genealogical record tracing the line from Adam through Seth toward Noah. The passage states that Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah, then walked with God 300 years after the birth of Methuselah, and had other sons and daughters. The passage's final verse, 24, contains the detail that generated centuries of subsequent interpretive attention, stating that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him, a formulation notably different from the standard genealogical refrain used for every other figure in the surrounding chapter, which states plainly that each lived a certain number of years and then died. Enoch alone, among the entire genealogical line from Adam to Noah, is not described as dying. This textual anomaly, a genealogical entry that deliberately breaks its own surrounding pattern by omitting the expected statement of death, did not go unnoticed by ancient Jewish interpreters. Dr. James Vanderkam's earlier monograph specifically dedicated to this question, Enoch and the Growth of an Apocalyptic Tradition, published by the Catholic Biblical Association of America in 1984, traces in detail how this brief, anomalous biblical notice became, across the Second Temple period, the seed for an entire expansive body of literature exploring what exactly happened to Enoch during and after his unusual departure from ordinary human mortality, of which the composite text examined throughout this documentary represents the most extensive and best preserved example. Though Vanderkam's research documents that Enoch traditions also appear, in varying forms, across other Second Temple period Jewish literature including Jubilees, itself another text preserved through the Ethiopian canon and recovered in fragment form at Qumran, and later rabbinic literature that, notably, takes a considerably more cautious, and in some cases actively suspicious stance toward the expansive Enoch traditions that had developed by the early centuries of the Common Era. This rabbinic caution deserves direct acknowledgement as part of a complete and honest account of the text's reception history, because it represents an important counterpoint to the Ethiopian Church's sustained preservation and canonical inclusion of the same material. Dr. Philip Alexander, in his extensive published work on Second Temple period Enoch traditions, including his contribution to the multi-volume Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, documents that later Rabbinic Judaism, particularly following the codification of the Mishnah and subsequent Talmudic literature between the 2nd and 6th centuries of the Common Era, generally moved away from the expansive apocalyptic Enoch traditions that had flourished during the Second Temple period with some rabbinic sources expressing explicit unease about traditions, describing a human figure being transformed into or closely associated with a heavenly, quasi-divine status, a theological concern distinct from, but related to, the concerns that would later drive the 4th century Christian council's exclusion of the text from their own developing canon. What this broader reception history demonstrates, when placed alongside the Ethiopian Church's parallel and independent decision to preserve and canonize the same material, is that the text's status has never been a matter of simple, uncontested consensus across any single religious tradition, Jewish or Christian, ancient or modern. It has instead been a genuinely contested body of literature, embraced enthusiastically by some communities across some periods, most notably the Qumran sect and the enduring Ethiopian Church, and treated with caution, suspicion, or outright exclusion by others, including mainstream rabbinic Judaism following the Second Temple period's end and the mainstream Western and Eastern Christian traditions following the 4th century councils. Presenting this documentary's material honestly requires acknowledging that contested history rather than presenting the text's authority as a matter of unanimous ancient consensus that was later suppressed by a single, unified conspiracy of exclusion. The historical reality, as the scholarship this documentary has cited throughout makes clear, is considerably more textured, a genuine, centuries-spanning theological debate about how to properly understand and categorize an unusually specific and detailed body of apocalyptic literature attributed to a figure whose entire scriptural footprint, prior to the expansive traditions that developed around him, consisted of a handful of anomalous verses in a genealogical list. That said, the specific reasons various communities gave for their caution or exclusion are themselves worth examining closely, because they bear directly on how a contemporary viewer should weigh the text's content. The concerns raised by rabbinic sources, according to Alexander's research, centered primarily on the risk of the Enoch traditions elevating a human figure to a status rabbinic theology reserved exclusively for God, a specific Christological adjacent concern that, notably, some scholars, including Dr. Andrei Orlov of Marquette University, in his extensive published work on the Enoch Metatron tradition within later Jewish mysticism, have argued actually persisted and continued developing within certain strands of Jewish mystical literature, including the later Hekhalot and Merkavah mystical texts, and eventually the medieval Sefer Hekhalot, or Third Enoch, suggesting that even the rabbinic tradition's official caution did not entirely extinguish ongoing Jewish interest in and engagement with Enochic themes, but rather channeled that engagement into different, more esoteric literary contexts operating somewhat outside mainstream rabbinic authority. The Christian Council's concerns, as this documentary noted in its opening sections, centered on different specific issues. Jerome's stated discomfort with what he characterized as the text's fantastic claims, and Augustine's argument that its apocalyptic imagery should be read as metaphor rather than literal cosmological or historical claim. Neither of these concerns, it's worth noting explicitly, directly engaged with or attempted to refute the specific content of the 7 signs this documentary has examined. Neither Jerome nor Augustine, in their surviving writings on the subject, offers a substantive counter-argument to the text's warnings about knowledge acceleration, forbidden technological boundaries, escalating warfare, environmental degradation, demographic scattering and regathering, false teaching, or the ultimate revelation of the Son of Man. Their objections, as preserved in the historical record, concern broader questions of genre, canonicity, and theological categorization, not specific, falsifiable disputes with the particular content this documentary has focused on throughout. This distinction matters for a final, honest assessment of what this documentary has and has not established. The ancient councils and church fathers who excluded Enoch from the developing Christian canon did not do so because they had examined and rejected the specific 7 signs this documentary has traced. Through the modern historical and scientific record, a record that of course did not yet exist in any form they could have anticipated or evaluated, their exclusion was a broader canonical and theological judgment made on different grounds entirely, and one that, as this documentary's opening sections established, the Ethiopian Church never accepted, maintaining instead an unbroken 16th century tradition of treating the text as authoritative scripture, carrying genuine ongoing relevance to understanding the approach of the final period its authors describe. There is one final body of evidence worth examining before this documentary closes, because it addresses a specific question a careful viewer would reasonably raise about the seven-sign framework as a whole, whether the specific number 7 itself carries independent significance within the text, or whether this documentary has imposed an external organizational scheme onto material that does not naturally group itself this way. The number 7 recurs throughout Enoch's composite text with a frequency and consistency that multiple scholars have identified as deliberate rather than incidental. The Apocalypse of Weeks, already discussed extensively in this documentary's treatment of the seventh sign, organizes the entirety of world history into 10 discrete weeks, but places particular emphasis, according to Dr. Vanderkam's detailed structural analysis, on the 7th week specifically as a hinge point, the period in which the text's own composition and its immediate readers are situated, marking the transition from the historical weeks already completed to the final, climactic weeks still to come. The astronomical book's calendrical system, similarly, organizes its solar and lunar calculations around cycles that Dr. Otto Neugebauer's technical analysis identified as built on foundational 7-day and 7-year structural units, consistent with but independently derived from the 7-day week structure already established in the Genesis creation account the wider Enochic tradition takes as its narrative starting point. Dr. Nickelsburg's commentary notes that this pattern of sevens is not unique to Enoch within the broader Second Temple apocalyptic literary tradition, appearing also in Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy in chapter 9 of that canonical book, and in the Qumran community's own sectarian literature, including the War Scrolls description of a climactic conflict organized around a symbolic structure of repeated sevens. This broader pattern suggests that 7 functioned across multiple independently authored Second Temple period texts as an established symbolic framework for organizing historical periods and their culmination, rather than as an arbitrary numerical device unique to any single author's individual literary preference. Against this background, the specific 7 signs this documentary has organized and presented, while representing this documentary's own analytical synthesis of material scattered across the text's 5 composite sections rather than a single, explicit 7-item list, the ancient authors themselves compiled in one place, nonetheless draws on source material saturated with exactly this kind of 7-fold structural thinking, making the 7-sign organizational framework a reasonable and textually grounded synthesis rather than an artificial imposition disconnected from the text's own internal patterns of thought. It's worth being fully transparent about this synthesis, because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging precisely what has been done throughout this documentary. Enoch's authors did not sit down and compose a single passage listing 7 discrete signs in the sequential order this documentary has presented them. What they did compose, across 5 separately authored sections spanning several centuries, is a body of material that, when carefully read, cross-referenced, and organized by the extensive body of published scholarship this documentary has drawn on throughout, yields 7 distinct, identifiable, and independently checkable claims about conditions preceding a final, climactic event. This documentary's contribution has been the organization and the extensive cross-referencing against the modern historical and scientific record, not the invention of the underlying claims themselves, each of which is drawn directly from specific, cited chapters and verses, translated by recognized scholars working from primary manuscript sources, and interpreted according to the published consensus or, where genuine scholarly debate exists, the range of established scholarly positions on the relevant passages. There is a further practical dimension worth addressing directly before this documentary concludes, because throughout, the emphasis has been on documentation and verification, rather than on what any individual viewer might reasonably do with this information once they have absorbed it. The text itself, as this documentary has noted repeatedly, resists providing a specific calculative answer to that question, explicitly and consistently declining to offer readers a countdown or a specific date they could use to plan around a predicted event. What it offers instead, across its various sections, is a consistent ethical and reflective orientation, an instruction to its readers about the posture appropriate to living within a period the text describes as significant, whatever ultimate framework any individual reader brings to interpreting that significance. Chapter 91. Part of the epistle material examined extensively in this documentary's treatment of the 6th sign includes a passage often referred to by scholars as Enoch's Testament, presented as the patriarch's final instruction to his children before his departure, urging them toward righteousness and warning them away from the paths of violence and deceit the surrounding chapters associate with the final period's characteristic corruptions. This testamentary framing, a dying or departing figure offering final ethical instruction to those who will continue living after them, is a well-established literary genre within both biblical and broader ancient Near Eastern literature, appearing also in Jacob's blessing of his sons in Genesis 49 and Moses' final address to Israel in Deuteronomy. Enoch's testament, read within this broader genre context, functions similarly, offering not a specific prediction to be verified or falsified on a particular date, but an enduring ethical orientation intended to remain relevant and applicable across every generation of readers who encounter it, precisely because its author, according to the text's own explicit framing throughout, did not know, and did not claim to know, exactly when the final period's climactic event would arrive. This documentary has attempted, throughout its examination of all 7 signs, to model that same disciplined restraint, presenting extensive, checkable documentation for 6 conditions the historical and scientific record indicates are substantially or actively fulfilled, while remaining equally clear, consistent, and explicit that the 7th and final sign, the actual event those 6 conditions are described as preceding, remains unfulfilled, its specific timing a matter the text itself, corroborated by the closely related New Testament material examined throughout, explicitly and repeatedly places beyond any reader's capacity to calculate in advance. No matter how carefully or how thoroughly that reader has studied the 6 signs already documented and confirmed, what remains, then, is not a prediction but a description, carefully documented, extensively sourced, and checkable against the published record of institutions with no theological stake whatsoever in whether their data happen to align with an ancient text's language. A description of 6 conditions, verified, and a 7th, still ahead, its arrival certain according to the text's own repeated and consistent framing across all 5 of its composite sections, but its timing deliberately, explicitly left unknown, not as an oversight or a gap in the prophecy, but as what the relevant scholarship consistently identifies as the text's own deliberate, structural choice. A choice that shapes how every one of its readers, across every generation, from the community that hid it in caves above the Dead Sea, to the monks who preserved it by hand across 16 centuries in the Ethiopian highlands, to any viewer encountering this material today, is invited to receive it, not as a countdown to be calculated, but as a description of the moment they find themselves already living within. A brief word, finally, on why a text carrying this specific configuration, 6 checkable signs, and 1 still unfulfilled climactic event, deserves the sustained, careful attention this documentary has given it. Rather than either credulous overstatement or dismissive neglect, the 2 postures that most popular treatment of ancient apocalyptic literature tends toward. The credulous overstatement this documentary has deliberately avoided would involve treating the 6 fulfilled or actively developing signs as proof of the 7th sign's imminent arrival. Using the accumulated weight of documented evidence to construct an implicit countdown the text itself explicitly warns against. This documentary has instead maintained, consistently across all 7 signs, the distinction the text's own scholarship insists on between description of accumulating conditions and prediction of specific culminating timing. A distinction Dr. Allison's work on the closely related synoptic apocalyptic material identifies as central to the entire genre's proper interpretation, and one this documentary has tried to honor throughout, rather than collapsing for the sake of a more dramatic or definitive conclusion. The dismissive neglect this documentary has equally avoided would involve treating the entire body of correspondence between ancient text and modern record as too coincidental or too vague to warrant serious examination, a posture that, when weighed against the specific, checkable, institutionally sourced evidence this documentary has presented for each of the 6 substantially fulfilled signs, from the exact zettabyte figures published by the International Data Corporation to the specific 2018 court case involving He Jiankui's germline editing experiment to the precise 90 seconds to midnight assessment, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists across its most recent annual updates, does not survive careful scrutiny. These are not vague, easily dismissed generalities. They are specific, dated, sourced claims, each independently verifiable against the primary institutional records this documentary has cited throughout. Between these 2 postures, credulous overstatement and dismissive neglect, lies the approach this documentary has attempted to model consistently across its full-length, careful documentation of what can be verified, honest acknowledgement of what remains genuinely uncertain or actively debated within the relevant scholarship, and explicit, repeated clarity about the specific, crucial distinction the ancient text itself insists on between conditions that accumulate and become identifiable, and a culminating event whose timing no reader in any generation, including this one, is in a position to calculate. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, whose 16th century custodianship of this text made every claim examined throughout this documentary possible to verify in the first place, describes its relationship to Enoch, according to Patriarch Abune Matthias's own public statements already cited, not primarily as possession of a predictive tool, but as stewardship of a treasure entrusted to the Church on behalf of the wider Christian world, language that emphasizes preservation and transmission over calculation and prediction. A framing this documentary has found consistently reinforced by the academic scholarship examined throughout, from Nicholsberg and Vanderkam's Hermeneia commentary to Stuckenbruck's work on the epistle to Allison's research on the closely related gospel material. What this documentary leaves its viewers with, then, is not a date, not a countdown, and not a claim to certainty the underlying text itself explicitly and repeatedly declines to offer. It leaves instead a documented, extensively sourced account of 6 specific ancient claims that correspond in detail checkable against the published record of dozens of scientific, governmental, and academic institutions with no theological interest whatsoever in the outcome, to conditions substantially or actively present in the world today, alongside a 7th claim, equally ancient, equally specific in its description, and equally documented as not yet fulfilled by the unanimous testimony of every relevant scholarly tradition this documentary has drawn upon throughout. Whatever any individual viewer ultimately concludes about the significance of that specific configuration, the manuscript history, the textual scholarship, and the modern documentary record examined throughout this presentation stand as a matter of verifiable, checkable fact, available for any viewer to examine further, cross-reference, and evaluate independently, exactly as the 11 scribes at Qumran, the generations of monks at Axum, and the modern scholars at Oxford, Notre Dame, King's College London, and dozens of other institutions have each, in their own way and across their own specific historical moment, done before. One last comparison is worth drawing before this documentary reaches its final word, because it returns to the specific image this documentary opened with, the 11 copies of Enoch found sealed in caves above the Dead Sea, and asks what that specific act of preservation, undertaken by people living roughly 2,000 years before any of the modern evidence examined throughout this documentary existed to be checked, actually represents. The Qumran community, according to the extensive archaeological and textual scholarship surrounding the site, generally understood by researchers including Dr. Lawrence Schiffman of New York University in his extensive published work on the sect's own self-understanding as preserved in their sectarian documents, to have understood themselves as living in a period of heightened significance, a community that had withdrawn from the wider Judean society specifically because they believed that society had become corrupted in ways consistent with the very warnings this documentary has traced throughout Enoch's epistle. Material. Their decision to copy Enoch 11 separate times, more than nearly any other text recovered from their library, was not an antiquarian preservation project undertaken out of general historical interest. It was, according to the community's own surviving sectarian literature, an act undertaken by people who believed the text described their own historical moment, who read its warnings about corrupted knowledge, escalating violence, and false teaching as directly applicable to the world they were actually living in, and who accordingly took extraordinary, costly measures, hand-copying an entire lengthy composite text 11 separate times, using resources and scribal labor. A small desert community could not have possessed an unlimited supply to ensure that text survived. They were wrong, in the most straightforward sense available to historical judgment, about the specific timing of the final event Enoch's 7th sign describes. The Qumran community itself was destroyed, according to the archaeological evidence excavated at the site and interpreted by researchers including Dr. Jody Magnus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in her extensive published archaeological work on the site, most likely during the Jewish revolt against Rome in the years leading up to 68 of the Common Era, the same conflict that would culminate in the destruction of the Second Temple 2 years later, an event the community's own surviving literature gives no indication they anticipated occurring in the specific form and timing it actually took. Whatever specific calculation or expectation the Qumran community held regarding the timing of Enoch's climactic 7th sign, that expectation did not match what actually occurred in their own lifetime, A sobering historical fact this documentary considers important to state plainly rather than omit for the sake of a cleaner narrative. And yet their preservation effort succeeded precisely because it was not contingent on their specific timing expectations being correct. The scrolls survived, sealed in jars and caves above the Dead Sea, entirely independent of whether the community that hid them lived to see the event they may have believed was imminent. Nearly 2,000 years later, that preservation effort is what allows Dr. Nibs, Dr. Isaacs, and every subsequent scholar's textual work to be cross-checked against a manuscript tradition independent of the Ethiopian Church's own separate, equally extraordinary preservation effort, providing exactly the kind of corroborating evidence this documentary is drawn on throughout to establish that the 7 signs examined here represent the ancient text's actual, verifiable content, not a later interpolation or corruption introduced at some point during the long transmission process. There is a lesson embedded in that specific historical outcome, whatever theological framework any individual viewer brings to interpreting it. The Qumran community's error regarding specific timing did not diminish the value or accuracy of what they preserved. Their act of preservation, undertaken out of a conviction that the text mattered regardless of exactly when its final sign would be fulfilled, is precisely what made the extensive documentation this entire presentation has relied on possible in the first place. The text survived not because anyone successfully calculated a date, an act the text itself explicitly and repeatedly warns against attempting, but because successive communities across vastly different historical contexts, separated by geography, language, and centuries of no contact, each independently concluded that the text's content mattered enough to preserve regardless of that uncertainty. That is, in the end, the posture this documentary has attempted to model throughout its examination of all 7 signs, careful preservation and transmission of what can be documented and verified, honest acknowledgement of what remains genuinely unknown, and a consistent refusal to convert the former into false certainty about the latter, following the same discipline the text's own most careful scholars, and the communities that risked genuine effort and resources to preserve it across 2 millennia, have each modeled in their own specific historical moment. From the desert community that hid 11 copies in jars above the Dead Sea, to the monks who kept the flame of transmission alive, unbroken, generation after generation, in the highlands surrounding Axum, there is a final, brief detail worth including, drawn from the physical condition of the manuscripts themselves rather than their content. Conservators working on the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, according to published conservation reports from the Israel Antiquities Authority's own preservation laboratory, have noted that many of the Enoch fragments recovered from Qumran show wear patterns consistent with frequent handling and repeated consultation, rather than the wear patterns typically associated with documents stored once and left largely undisturbed, a physical, material detail suggesting the community that preserved these copies returned to them regularly, read them, and treated them as living, actively consulted texts rather than archival curiosities set aside and forgotten. The same pattern of active, ongoing engagement characterizes the Ethiopian manuscript tradition, where Enoch continues to this day to be read liturgically within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's ongoing worship life, not merely preserved as a historical artifact but actively used, generation after generation, exactly as its earliest known custodians used it as well, across a span of time that now stretches back well over 2,000 years and shows no sign, based on the Church's own continuing practice, of coming to an end anytime soon. All 6 full signs, now fully verified against the historical record. 1 sign, still ahead, its timing deliberately, explicitly unknowable to any reader in any generation. That is what the manuscript says. That is what the scholarship confirms. And that is where, according to a text that has survived exclusion, war, empire, and 16 centuries of official erasure, specifically because a small church in the Ethiopian highlands refused to let it disappear, we now stand.